Moral relativism is the philosophical position that ethical principles and moral judgments are not absolute, but instead depend on cultural, historical, or personal contexts. It argues that what is considered right or wrong varies between societies and individuals, rejecting the idea of universal moral truths. This perspective contrasts with moral absolutism, which holds that some moral principles apply to all people at all times. Moral relativism has been a subject of debate for centuries, with proponents arguing that it promotes tolerance and understanding, while critics contend that it leads to moral ambiguity and even justifies unethical behavior. One form of moral relativism is cultural relativism, which suggests that morality is deeply embedded in cultural norms and traditions. What one society considers morally acceptable may be viewed as immoral by another. For example, some cultures practice arranged marriages and see them as a fundamental social institution, while others view them as restricting individual freedom. Similarly, practices such as polygamy, capital punishment, or dietary restrictions vary widely across cultures, demonstrating that moral judgments are often tied to social customs rather than universal principles. Proponents of cultural relativism argue that it fosters an appreciation of cultural diversity and prevents ethnocentric judgments. However, critics argue that it can be used to justify harmful traditions, such as female genital mutilation or honor killings, simply because they are culturally accepted in certain societies. Another form of moral relativism is individual relativism, which holds that morality is subjective and based on personal beliefs rather than cultural norms. According to this view, individuals determine their own moral standards, leading to a highly personalized ethical framework. While this allows for moral autonomy, it also raises concerns about inconsistency and moral chaos. If each person decides what is right or wrong, there is no common ethical foundation to resolve conflicts. For instance, one person might believe that lying is acceptable in certain situations, while another might view all forms of deception as inherently wrong. This lack of agreement can make it difficult to establish social norms or laws that apply universally. The philosophical roots of moral relativism can be traced back to ancient thinkers such as the Greek sophists, who argued that moral principles are human-made rather than divine or natural laws. Protagoras, a famous sophist, claimed that man is the measure of all things, suggesting that truth, including moral truth, is determined by human perception. This idea resurfaced in the works of later philosophers like Friedrich Nietzsche, who rejected absolute moral values and argued that morality is a construct shaped by power dynamics and historical circumstances. Nietzsche's critique of objective morality influenced existentialist and postmodernist thinkers, who further developed the idea that morality is a fluid and evolving concept rather than a fixed set of rules. One of the key arguments in favor of moral relativism is that it promotes tolerance and open-mindedness. By acknowledging that different cultures and individuals have diverse moral perspectives, moral relativism encourages respect for alternative viewpoints. In a globalized world where societies are increasingly interconnected, understanding different moral systems is essential for peaceful coexistence. Moral relativism can also help prevent moral imperialism, where one culture imposes its ethical standards on another. For example, Western countries often criticize certain practices in non-Western societies, such as dress codes or religious customs, without fully understanding their cultural significance. A relativist approach encourages a more nuanced perspective that considers historical and social contexts before passing moral judgment. However, critics argue that moral relativism can lead to moral paralysis, making it difficult to condemn obvious injustices. If morality is entirely subjective or culturally determined, then no moral standpoint is inherently superior to another. This could mean that practices such as slavery, genocide, or discrimination cannot be universally condemned because they may be acceptable in certain societies or to certain individuals. Critics argue that this extreme relativism undermines moral progress by allowing harmful customs to persist under the guise of cultural differences. For instance, the abolition of slavery and the advancement of human rights were driven by the belief in universal moral principles, such as justice and equality. If these principles were merely relative, the justification for moral progress would be significantly weakened. Another challenge for moral relativism is its inconsistency when applied in practice. While relativists advocate for tolerance, this very principle can be seen as an absolute moral value, contradicting the core idea of moral relativism. If tolerance is universally good, then at least one moral principle is absolute, which undermines the relativist position. Additionally, moral relativism can struggle to address moral disagreements. If two individuals or cultures have conflicting moral beliefs, relativism offers no clear way to resolve these conflicts. For example, if one culture believes in gender equality and another upholds strict gender roles, a relativist approach does not provide a basis for mediation or ethical critique. Despite these criticisms, moral relativism remains an influential perspective in contemporary ethical discussions. Many debates in ethics, such as those surrounding LGBTQ+ rights, euthanasia, and freedom of speech, involve questions about cultural norms and individual beliefs. Advocates of moral relativism argue that recognizing moral diversity allows for more inclusive and flexible ethical discussions. In contrast, opponents worry that excessive moral relativism can lead to moral ambiguity, making it difficult to establish legal and ethical standards in a pluralistic society. Some philosophers attempt to find a middle ground between relativism and absolutism through moral pluralism. This view suggests that while moral values may vary, there are still some fundamental ethical principles that apply across cultures. For instance, concepts like fairness, reciprocity, and human dignity appear in many moral systems, even if they are interpreted differently. Moral pluralism acknowledges cultural differences while maintaining that some ethical standards, such as prohibitions against murder or torture, are necessary for societal stability and human well-being. In practical terms, societies often adopt a hybrid approach to morality. While legal systems recognize cultural differences in ethical beliefs, they also establish overarching principles to ensure social cohesion. International human rights laws, for example, reflect a blend of moral relativism and universalism. While they respect cultural variations, they also uphold certain fundamental rights that are considered essential for all human beings. This approach seeks to balance the respect for moral diversity with the need for ethical consistency in addressing global challenges. The debate over moral relativism is unlikely to be resolved definitively, as it touches on deeply rooted questions about human nature, culture, and ethics. However, understanding the arguments for and against moral relativism can help individuals navigate ethical dilemmas in a complex and diverse world. Whether one embraces moral relativism or leans toward universal principles, the key is to engage with moral questions thoughtfully and critically, recognizing both the strengths and limitations of different ethical perspectives. Ethical egoism is the philosophical theory that moral actions are those that promote an individual's self-interest. It asserts that people should act in ways that maximize their own well-being, as opposed to prioritizing the needs of others or following universal moral rules. This perspective contrasts with altruism, which holds that people have a moral duty to consider the welfare of others. Ethical egoism is often associated with philosophers such as Ayn Rand, who argued that rational self-interest is the foundation of a moral society. While ethical egoism provides a straightforward approach to morality, It also raises concerns about selfishness, social cooperation, and moral responsibility. One of the key arguments for ethical egoism is that it aligns with human nature. Proponents argue that self-interest is an inherent and natural motivation for human behavior. People seek food, shelter, financial success, and personal happiness because these things contribute to their survival and well-being. Even acts of apparent altruism, such as donating to charity or helping a friend, can be interpreted as self-serving, as they often bring personal satisfaction, social recognition, or reciprocal benefits. Ethical egoists claim that instead of denying self-interest, morality should embrace and refine it, ensuring that individuals pursue their own good in a rational and productive manner. Ethical egoism differs from psychological egoism, which is the descriptive claim that people always act in their own self-interest, whether they realize it or not. Psychological egoism suggests that altruism is an illusion, because even seemingly selfless acts are ultimately driven by personal motives, such as avoiding guilt or gaining approval. Ethical egoism, on the other hand, is a normative theory. It does not claim that people always act in their self-interest, but rather that they should do so. This distinction is important because ethical egoism presents a moral guideline rather than a claim about human psychology. One advantage of ethical egoism is that it provides a clear and consistent decision-making framework. Instead of struggling with conflicting moral obligations or abstract ethical principles, individuals can focus on what benefits them the most. This practical approach simplifies moral reasoning, as actions can be judged based on whether they enhance personal well-being. Ethical egoists argue that this approach leads to greater personal happiness and fulfillment, as it encourages individuals to set goals, work hard, and make rational choices that improve their own lives. Critics, however, argue that ethical egoism can lead to social conflict and moral breakdown. If everyone prioritizes their own interests above all else, cooperation and trust in society may erode. For example, if businesses operated solely based on self-interest without ethical considerations, they might exploit workers, deceive customers, or harm the environment. While ethical egoists may argue that long-term self-interest includes building good relationships and maintaining a positive reputation, there are cases where unethical behavior may provide short-term advantages. Without moral principles that consider the well-being of others, ethical egoism can justify actions that harm society as a whole. Another issue with ethical egoism is its incompatibility with moral impartiality. Many ethical theories emphasize fairness, justice, and equality, arguing that morality should apply to all people equally. Ethical egoism, however, prioritizes the interests of the individual, making it difficult to justify why one person's well-being should matter more than another's. If two people's interests conflict, ethical egoism does not provide a clear way to resolve the dispute other than suggesting that each person should act in their own best interest. This approach can lead to ethical dilemmas where no mutually beneficial solution exists. Some defenders of ethical egoism claim that it ultimately benefits society, as individuals who pursue their own interests contribute to economic and social progress. Ayn Rand, one of the most famous proponents of ethical egoism, argued that a society based on rational self-interest leads to innovation, productivity, and personal responsibility. She believed that self-sacrifice and collectivist ethics stifle individual achievement and economic growth. According to this view, ethical egoism does not mean harming others, but rather focusing on one's own success in a way that naturally benefits society. For example, entrepreneurs who build successful businesses create jobs, improve technology, and contribute to economic growth, all while acting in their own self-interest. Despite these arguments, ethical egoism remains controversial because it struggles to address moral obligations toward others. Most moral theories recognize duties such as honesty, fairness, and compassion, even when they do not directly benefit the individual. Ethical egoism does not require individuals to help others, unless doing so aligns with their own interests. This perspective can lead to morally questionable conclusions, such as justifying neglect of the poor, or refusing to help someone in need unless there is a personal gain. Critics argue that a moral theory should provide reasons for caring about others beyond self-interest, as morality often involves making sacrifices for the greater good. Another challenge to ethical egoism is that it fails as a universal moral principle. If everyone followed ethical egoism, conflicts of interest would be inevitable. For example, in a competitive situation, such as a job interview or a legal dispute, each person acting solely in their own self-interest may lead to manipulation, deception, or exploitation. Ethical theories that promote fairness and cooperation, such as utilitarianism or deontology, offer ways to balance competing interests, while ethical egoism simply encourages individuals to prioritize themselves, even at the expense of others. This limitation makes it difficult for ethical egoism to function as a guiding principle for society as a whole. Some philosophers propose limited or modified forms of ethical egoism to address these concerns. One approach is rational egoism, which argues that individuals should act in their self-interest, but also recognize the long-term benefits of cooperation and ethical behavior. A rational egoist may help others, keep promises, and follow social norms because doing so ultimately serves their own interests. This version of egoism acknowledges that humans are social beings who depend on others for success and well-being, making it more compatible with ethical principles such as trust and reciprocity. Another variation is contractual egoism, which suggests that individuals should follow moral rules based on mutual agreements that benefit everyone. In this view, people recognize that working together and respecting others' rights create a stable and prosperous society, which in turn benefits their own interests. Contractual egoism provides a way to balance self-interest with the need for social order, making it more practical than pure ethical egoism. Despite its challenges, ethical egoism continues to influence modern discussions on morality, economics, and politics. The debate between self-interest and altruism remains relevant in areas such as business ethics, political philosophy, and personal decision-making. While most moral theories advocate for some degree of concern for others, ethical egoism forces individuals to reconsider the role of self-interest in ethical reasoning. Whether one agrees with it or not, ethical egoism provides an important perspective on how individuals navigate moral choices in a world where personal and collective interests often intersect. Utilitarianism is a moral theory that evaluates actions based on their consequences, specifically in terms of maximizing happiness or minimizing suffering. It is a form of consequentialism, meaning that the morality of an action is determined by its outcome rather than by intentions or adherence to moral rules. The core principle of utilitarianism is the greatest happiness principle, which states that the best action is the one that produces the most overall happiness or the least harm for the greatest number of people. This theory is closely associated with philosophers such as Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, who developed and refined its key ideas. One of the main strengths of utilitarianism is its focus on measurable outcomes. Unlike deontological ethics, which emphasizes following rules or duties regardless of the consequences, utilitarianism provides a flexible framework that considers the real-world impact of actions. This makes it particularly useful in decision-making processes where competing interests must be weighed. For example, in public policy, utilitarian reasoning is often used to determine the best allocation of resources, such as healthcare funding or environmental regulations, by assessing which policies will benefit the most people. There are different forms of utilitarianism, each with its own approach to evaluating moral actions. Act utilitarianism assesses each action individually, considering whether it leads to the greatest happiness in that specific situation. If lying in a particular scenario would prevent significant harm and increase overall happiness, an act utilitarian would consider it morally acceptable. However, this approach can be unpredictable and difficult to apply consistently, as each situation requires careful calculation of consequences. Rule utilitarianism, on the other hand, evaluates actions based on general rules that tend to produce the most happiness when followed consistently. Instead of judging each action in isolation, rule utilitarians argue that moral guidelines should be established to promote long-term well-being. For example, while lying may produce happiness in some cases, a general rule against lying is likely to create more trust and stability in society, ultimately leading to greater happiness overall. Rule utilitarianism seeks to balance flexibility with moral consistency, addressing some of the concerns associated with act utilitarianism. One of the major advantages of utilitarianism is its impartiality. It does not favor any one individual or group over another, but instead considers the well-being of all affected parties. This makes it an appealing ethical framework for addressing issues of social justice and fairness. Utilitarian reasoning has been used to advocate for human rights, economic policies that reduce poverty, and medical decisions that prioritize saving the most lives. By focusing on the collective good, utilitarianism encourages ethical decision-making that transcends personal biases or societal traditions. However, critics argue that utilitarianism can lead to moral dilemmas and unjust outcomes. Because it focuses solely on outcomes, it may justify actions that seem intuitively immoral if they lead to greater overall happiness. For instance, in the classic trolley problem, a utilitarian would likely choose to sacrifice one person to save 5 others, as this maximizes happiness. While this reasoning seems logical, it raises concerns about individual rights. In extreme cases, utilitarianism could justify harming innocent people if doing so benefits the majority, which contradicts many moral intuitions. Another challenge is that happiness and suffering are difficult to quantify. While utilitarianism aims to maximize well-being, defining and measuring happiness can be complex. People experience happiness in different ways, and what benefits one person might not benefit another. Additionally, predicting the long-term consequences of an action is often uncertain, making it difficult to determine whether an action truly maximizes happiness. For example, a government policy designed to improve the economy might lead to unintended negative consequences, such as environmental damage or job loss, complicating utilitarian calculations. Some critics also argue that utilitarianism demands too much from individuals, requiring them to always act in ways that maximize happiness, even at personal cost. If every decision must be made based on maximizing collective well-being, personal relationships and individual autonomy may be sacrificed. A strict utilitarian might argue that spending money on a vacation is morally wrong if that money could instead be donated to save lives. While utilitarian principles can promote generosity and social responsibility, they can also place excessive moral burdens on individuals. To address these challenges, some philosophers have proposed preference utilitarianism, which focuses on fulfilling individual preferences rather than maximizing happiness alone. This version of utilitarianism acknowledges that people have different desires and values, and it seeks to maximize the satisfaction of those preferences rather than imposing a single standard of happiness. Preference utilitarianism has been influential in areas such as medical ethics, where respecting patients' choices is considered a key ethical principle. Another refinement is negative utilitarianism, which prioritizes minimizing suffering over maximizing happiness. Some philosophers argue that reducing extreme pain and suffering should take precedence over increasing overall pleasure. Negative utilitarianism has been applied to discussions on animal rights, global health initiatives, and humanitarian interventions, where the focus is on alleviating suffering rather than simply maximizing happiness. Despite its criticisms, utilitarianism remains a widely used ethical framework in fields such as economics, law, and public policy. It provides a rational, outcome-based approach to ethics that can be applied in diverse situations, from climate change policies to medical decision-making. The challenge for utilitarians is to refine the theory in ways that address its weaknesses while preserving its strengths. Whether in its classical form or through modern adaptations, utilitarianism continues to influence moral philosophy and practical decision-making, offering a powerful tool for evaluating the consequences of actions in an increasingly complex world. Nihilism is the philosophical belief that life lacks inherent meaning, value, or purpose. It challenges traditional moral, religious, and existential frameworks by asserting that there are no objective truths or universal principles governing human existence. Nihilism can take various forms, including moral, existential, and epistemological nihilism, each of which denies meaning in different aspects of life. This perspective has been explored by thinkers such as Friedrich Nietzsche, who warned of its dangers while also seeing it as an opportunity for personal and cultural transformation. One of the key aspects of nihilism is its rejection of absolute moral values. Moral nihilism argues that there are no objective moral truths, and that concepts of right and wrong are merely human inventions. Unlike ethical relativism, which suggests that moral values vary between cultures or individuals, moral nihilism denies the existence of any true moral framework altogether. This can lead to a sense of radical freedom, where individuals are not bound by conventional ethical norms. However, critics argue that moral nihilism can justify harmful behavior, as it provides no moral guidelines for distinguishing between good and evil. Existential nihilism extends this skepticism to human existence itself, arguing that life has no inherent purpose or significance. According to this view, all human achievements, emotions, and struggles are ultimately meaningless in the face of an indifferent universe. This perspective has been explored in literature and philosophy, particularly in existentialist works by thinkers such as Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. While Sartre acknowledged the lack of inherent meaning in life, he argued that individuals must create their own purpose. Camus, in contrast, viewed the absurdity of life as a challenge, proposing that people embrace existence despite its lack of ultimate meaning. Epistemological nihilism takes this skepticism further by questioning the possibility of knowledge itself. It argues that truth is either unknowable or non-existent, casting doubt on science, reason, and human understanding. This extreme form of skepticism challenges the foundations of philosophy and knowledge, leading to the idea that beliefs are merely social constructs rather than reflections of objective reality. While epistemological nihilism presents a radical critique of knowledge, it is often criticized for being self-defeating. If all knowledge is unreliable, then nihilism itself cannot be a valid claim. One of the most famous discussions of nihilism comes from Friedrich Nietzsche, who saw it as a crisis facing Western civilization. Nietzsche argued that the death of God, the decline of religious and metaphysical beliefs, would lead to a void in moral values and meaning. Without a higher authority to provide purpose, people would struggle with despair and meaninglessness. However, Nietzsche did not simply accept nihilism as an end point. Instead, he encouraged individuals to overcome it by creating their own values and embracing the idea of the Übermensch, or overman, who lives beyond conventional morality. Nietzsche viewed nihilism as both a danger and an opportunity, a necessary stage in breaking free from outdated belief systems and forging new paths of meaning. Despite its bleak outlook, nihilism has influenced many areas of thought, including literature, art, and psychology. Absurdist literature, exemplified by Camus' novel The Stranger, explores the confrontation between human desire for meaning and the indifferent nature of the universe. In modern culture, nihilistic themes appear in films, music, and philosophy, often reflecting disillusionment with societal norms and existential uncertainty. Some artists and writers use nihilism to challenge conventions and provoke thought, turning a philosophy of meaninglessness into a creative force. Critics argue that nihilism can lead to despair, apathy, or destructive behavior. If life has no meaning, some may conclude that nothing matters, leading to passivity or self-destructive choices. This perspective is sometimes linked to existential crises or depression, where individuals struggle with the lack of inherent purpose. In its extreme form, nihilism can justify harmful or selfish actions, as it removes moral constraints that guide behavior. However, some thinkers argue that accepting the absence of inherent meaning does not necessarily lead to despair. Instead, it can inspire individuals to live authentically and make their own choices freely. Some responses to nihilism attempt to reclaim meaning without relying on absolute truths. Existentialists such as Sartre and Camus argue that while the universe lacks inherent purpose, individuals can create their own meaning through personal choices and commitments. This idea, often referred to as existentialist freedom, suggests that people must take responsibility for their lives, shaping their own values rather than relying on external sources. Similarly, some philosophers propose pragmatic approaches to meaning, suggesting that while objective meaning may not exist, subjective meaning can still be valuable and fulfilling. Another response is scientific humanism, which emphasizes human progress, reason, and the pursuit of knowledge as meaningful endeavors. While nihilism questions the value of science and morality, humanists argue that meaning can be found in discovery, creativity, and collective well-being. By focusing on improving human life and understanding the world, individuals can construct meaning even in the absence of inherent purpose. Despite its challenges, nihilism remains a powerful and influential philosophy, shaping discussions about meaning, morality, and knowledge. It forces individuals to confront the limits of certainty and the absence of absolute truths, encouraging deep reflection on the nature of existence. Whether one embraces nihilism fully or seeks alternatives, its influence continues to resonate in philosophical debates, artistic expression, and personal introspection. By acknowledging the void left by traditional belief systems, nihilism challenges individuals to navigate the complexities of life on their own terms, making it one of the most thought-provoking philosophical perspectives in history. Solipsism is the philosophical idea that only one's own mind is certain to exist. It suggests that knowledge of anything outside one's own consciousness is uncertain, and that the external world might not exist independently of the mind. This perspective raises fundamental questions about reality, perception, and the nature of knowledge. Solipsism can take different forms, including metaphysical, epistemological, and methodological variations, each with distinct implications. One of the core ideas behind solipsism is that human perception is inherently subjective. Everything experienced, sights, sounds, emotions, and thoughts, occurs within the mind. Because all knowledge is filtered through perception, there is no direct way to verify the existence of an external reality beyond one's own consciousness. This leads to the radical conclusion that external objects, other people, and even the universe itself might be mere projections of the mind rather than independently existing entities. Metaphysical solipsism takes this idea to its extreme, arguing that only the self exists and that the external world is an illusion. According to this view, everything outside personal consciousness, including other individuals, is either a creation of the mind or does not exist at all. This perspective leads to a form of radical self-centeredness, where the individual is the only certain entity. While few philosophers have fully endorsed this position, it remains an intriguing concept that challenges fundamental assumptions about existence. Epistemological solipsism is less extreme and focuses on the limits of human knowledge. It does not necessarily deny the existence of the external world, but argues that there is no way to confirm it with absolute certainty. This form of solipsism is closely related to skepticism, particularly the problem of external world skepticism. Philosophers such as René Descartes explored this idea, famously questioning whether an evil demon could be deceiving him into believing in a false reality. His conclusion, "I think, therefore I am," acknowledged the certainty of self-consciousness while leaving the nature of external reality unresolved. Methodological solipsism is a more practical approach that treats individual consciousness as the starting point for knowledge and inquiry. Rather than denying the external world, it suggests that all understanding must begin with the self and subjective experience. This perspective has influenced areas such as phenomenology and cognitive science, where researchers study perception and consciousness from the first-person perspective. Unlike metaphysical solipsism, which makes claims about reality, methodological solipsism is more of an approach to philosophical investigation. One of the major challenges of solipsism is its apparent inability to be disproven. Since all knowledge depends on perception, any evidence for the existence of an external world is itself a perception, leading to an infinite regress. If the world outside the mind is a mere projection, no external proof can refute solipsism. This makes it a frustratingly persistent problem in philosophy, as it raises doubts about the certainty of knowledge while providing no clear way to escape those doubts. Despite its radical implications, solipsism is often dismissed as impractical. If only one's mind exists, then all interactions with other people, scientific discoveries, and historical events would be meaningless illusions. This contradicts common sense and lived experience, making solipsism difficult to maintain as a working worldview. Even if one were to accept solipsism as a theoretical possibility, acting upon it would be nearly impossible. People naturally behave as if others exist, form relationships, and engage with the world in meaningful ways, making solipsism more of an intellectual exercise than a practical belief system. One of the strongest arguments against solipsism comes from intersubjectivity, the idea that multiple people experience and describe the same reality in consistent ways. If the world were a personal mental projection, it would be difficult to explain why other minds seem to function independently, and why their perspectives often align with one's own. For example, if two individuals see the same object and describe it similarly, this suggests an external reality that exists beyond either mind's control. While solipsists could argue that these interactions are part of their own illusion, the consistency of shared experiences makes this position difficult to sustain. Another challenge to solipsism is its conflict with scientific inquiry. Science is based on the assumption that an objective reality exists and that natural laws govern the universe. If solipsism were true, then scientific discoveries, technological advancements, and empirical data would all be mere illusions, which undermines the entire foundation of scientific progress. The success of science in predicting and manipulating the world suggests that there is an external reality that behaves according to consistent principles, making solipsism seem unlikely. Some philosophical perspectives, such as idealism, offer alternatives to solipsism while still acknowledging the role of perception in shaping reality. Idealists, such as George Berkeley, argue that reality consists of ideas and that material objects exist only insofar as they are perceived. However, unlike solipsists, idealists often maintain that a divine or collective consciousness sustains reality, allowing for the existence of an external world without requiring a purely material foundation. This provides a middle ground between solipsism and realism by emphasizing the importance of perception while still acknowledging a shared reality. In modern discussions, solipsism also intersects with debates about virtual reality and artificial intelligence. If technology can create highly immersive simulations that feel indistinguishable from reality, this raises questions about whether human perception is already operating within a kind of simulation. Some interpretations of digital philosophy and simulation theory suggest that consciousness itself might be experiencing a programmed or illusory reality, echoing solipsistic concerns about the uncertainty of the external world. While these ideas do not necessarily endorse solipsism, they illustrate how technological advances continue to challenge assumptions about perception and existence. Solipsism has also influenced existentialist and postmodern thought, where the emphasis on subjective experience leads to questions about reality, identity, and meaning. Some postmodern philosophers argue that knowledge and truth are constructed through language and interpretation rather than being objective facts. While this does not amount to full solipsism, it reflects a similar skepticism about the certainty of external reality and the limits of human understanding. Despite its philosophical significance, solipsism remains a deeply unsettling idea. It challenges not only the nature of reality, but also the foundations of human connection and meaning. If only the self is certain to exist, then relationships, emotions, and experiences lose their external significance. This existential isolation makes solipsism a troubling perspective, as it contradicts the deeply ingrained human need for connection and purpose. Some thinkers have attempted to reconcile solipsistic doubt with a more meaningful outlook on life. One approach is to accept that while certainty about the external world may be impossible, acting as if reality exists leads to a more fulfilling and functional existence. This perspective aligns with pragmatism, which argues that beliefs should be judged by their practical consequences rather than their absolute truth. By living as though the external world is real, individuals can engage with life in a meaningful way without requiring definitive proof of its existence. Another perspective is that solipsism, while logically irrefutable, is ultimately irrelevant to daily life. Even if the world were an illusion, the experiences within that illusion still matter. Pleasure, pain, love, and curiosity all remain subjectively real, regardless of their ultimate metaphysical status. In this view, solipsism does not negate meaning but instead shifts its focus to the immediate experience of consciousness itself. While solipsism remains one of the most perplexing and challenging ideas in philosophy, its implications extend beyond pure speculation. It forces deep reflection on the nature of reality, knowledge, and self-awareness, influencing discussions in metaphysics, science, and technology. Whether one dismisses it as an impractical thought experiment or sees it as a profound challenge to human understanding, solipsism continues to provoke some of the most fundamental questions about existence and the limits of perception. Existentialism is a philosophical movement that explores the nature of human existence, freedom, and personal responsibility. It is rooted in the idea that individuals must create their own meaning in an indifferent or even absurd universe. Unlike traditional philosophies that seek objective truths or universal moral laws, existentialism focuses on personal experience, subjective perception, and the choices that define an individual's life. One of the core ideas of existentialism is that existence precedes essence. This means that human beings are not born with a predetermined purpose or essence, but instead define themselves through their actions and choices. This concept stands in contrast to essentialist philosophies, which argue that human nature is fixed or determined by external factors such as religion, culture, or biology. Existentialist thinkers emphasize that individuals are responsible for shaping their own identities, making choices without relying on predetermined values or moral guidelines. A central theme in existentialism is the concept of freedom. Because existentialists reject the idea of an inherent purpose, they argue that individuals have radical freedom to make their own choices. However, with this freedom comes responsibility. Since there is no external authority dictating right and wrong, people must take full responsibility for the consequences of their actions. This responsibility can be overwhelming, leading to feelings of anxiety, dread, or despair. Jean-Paul Sartre, one of the most influential existentialist philosophers, described this burden as anguish, the weight of knowing that every choice we make contributes to defining our essence. Another key aspect of existentialism is the idea of authenticity. To live authentically means to embrace one's freedom and make choices that genuinely reflect one's values, rather than conforming to societal expectations or external pressures. Sartre criticized individuals who live in bad faith, meaning they deceive themselves into believing that their roles, labels, or circumstances define them. For example, a person who insists they must stay in an unfulfilling job because they have no choice is living in bad faith, as they are refusing to acknowledge their freedom to change their situation. Authenticity requires individuals to confront the truth of their existence and make deliberate, meaningful choices. One of the most profound existentialist concerns is the question of meaning. In a universe without inherent purpose, existentialists argue that people must create their own meaning through their actions, relationships, and personal projects. Albert Camus explored this theme through the concept of the absurd, the tension between humanity's search for meaning and the universe's apparent indifference. Camus famously illustrated this in his essay The Myth of Sisyphus, in which he compares human existence to the fate of Sisyphus, a figure in Greek mythology condemned to roll a boulder up a hill for eternity, only for it to roll back down each time. Despite the meaningless task, Camus argues that Sisyphus can find meaning in his struggle by embracing it. This perspective suggests that even in an absurd world, individuals can find fulfillment by living passionately and embracing their existence. Existentialism also explores the idea of alienation, or the feeling of being disconnected from the world, society, or even oneself. This theme is particularly evident in the works of existentialist writers such as Fyodor Dostoevsky and Franz Kafka. Many existentialist characters experience profound isolation as they struggle with the realization that traditional sources of meaning, such as religion, societal roles, or cultural norms, are inadequate. Instead of providing comfort, these external systems can sometimes deepen feelings of alienation by imposing false or superficial meaning onto life. In contrast to nihilism, which asserts that life is meaningless and often leads to despair, existentialism acknowledges the lack of inherent meaning, but sees this as an opportunity rather than a tragedy. By accepting the absence of a predetermined purpose, individuals are free to create their own values and meaning. This perspective has influenced not only philosophy but also literature, psychology, and even political thought. Existentialist ideas have been reflected in existential therapy, which helps individuals confront anxiety and find personal meaning, as well as in political movements that emphasize personal freedom and social responsibility. Although existentialism is often associated with atheism, not all existentialist thinkers reject the idea of God. Søren Kierkegaard, considered one of the earliest existentialists, was a Christian who argued that faith must be a deeply personal and subjective choice. He believed that true belief required a leap of faith, an acceptance of religious meaning despite the lack of rational proof. In contrast, atheistic existentialists like Sartre and Camus rejected the notion of a divine purpose and instead emphasized the individual's role in defining their own existence. Critics of existentialism argue that its emphasis on personal responsibility and freedom can lead to moral relativism, where any action can be justified based on individual choice. Without universal moral standards, some fear that existentialist ideas might encourage selfishness or a disregard for ethical principles. However, existentialists counter this by emphasizing the importance of authenticity, responsibility, and the impact of one's actions on others. Sartre, for example, argued that because individuals are free to choose, they must also recognize the responsibility of their choices in shaping humanity as a whole. Existentialist themes have had a profound influence on art, literature, and cinema. Writers such as Franz Kafka, Samuel Beckett, and Jean-Paul Sartre used existentialist ideas to explore themes of alienation, freedom, and absurdity. In film, directors like Ingmar Bergman and Michelangelo Antonioni have depicted existentialist struggles through characters facing moral dilemmas, isolation, and the search for meaning. The impact of existentialism can also be seen in modern discussions about identity, mental health, and the search for purpose in contemporary society. Existentialism remains relevant today because it addresses fundamental human concerns about freedom, identity, and meaning. In a world where traditional structures of meaning, such as religion, family, and societal roles, are increasingly questioned, existentialist ideas offer a framework for navigating uncertainty. The emphasis on personal choice and responsibility encourages individuals to actively shape their lives rather than passively accepting external definitions of success or fulfillment. The challenges posed by existentialism continue to provoke debate. Some embrace its message of self-determination, while others find its rejection of objective meaning unsettling. Regardless of whether one fully accepts its premises, existentialism invites deep reflection on what it means to be human and how to live a meaningful life. Its legacy endures in philosophy, literature, psychology, and contemporary discussions about personal and social responsibility, making it one of the most influential intellectual movements of the modern era. Absurdism is a philosophical concept that grapples with the inherent meaninglessness of life, yet insists on the human drive to search for meaning. This tension is central to the philosophy of absurdism, most notably articulated by thinkers such as Albert Camus and Søren Kierkegaard. At its core, absurdism is the recognition that humans seek meaning in a world that, on a fundamental level, does not provide it. This clash between the human quest for purpose and the universe's indifference leads to what is known as the absurd. The absurd arises from the realization that human beings have an innate desire to understand the world and their place in it. People naturally seek explanations, purpose, and order, whether through religion, philosophy, or science. We yearn for a sense of significance and direction, but the universe offers no answers, no guarantees, and no inherent meaning. The world operates independently of human desires for understanding, and this lack of correspondence between human expectations and the universe's indifference creates a profound sense of absurdity. It's the stark confrontation between the human need for meaning and the universe's lack of any discernible meaning that gives rise to the absurd. One of the central ideas of absurdism is the search for meaning itself. Humans are wired to seek understanding and purpose. This search manifests in countless ways, through religion, art, science, relationships, and personal ambitions. We invest our lives in finding answers, and this search often shapes our decisions and actions. However, the universe does not offer us a clear answer. Despite our longing for purpose, we are confronted with the fundamental truth that there is no objective meaning to the world. This disconnect between our pursuit of meaning and the universe's silence can feel deeply unsettling. The philosopher Albert Camus famously described this conflict in his essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. In this essay, Camus explores the concept of the absurd through the lens of the Greek myth of Sisyphus, a king condemned by the gods to roll a massive boulder up a hill, only for it to roll back down every time he reaches the top. This eternal, repetitive task is futile and without purpose, and yet Sisyphus continues to carry on, day after day. Camus uses this myth as a metaphor for the human condition. Like Sisyphus, humans are condemned to search for meaning in a universe that offers none. Our efforts may seem futile, but it is in the struggle itself, Camus suggests, that we find a kind of defiant meaning. Camus is clear that the recognition of the absurd does not necessarily lead to despair. Instead, it offers a kind of freedom. If life has no inherent meaning, then humans are free to create their own meaning. The absurd hero, as Camus calls them, is someone who accepts the absurdity of existence but continues to live passionately and authentically. In fact, the absurd hero embraces the absurd by living fully, despite knowing that the struggle itself is the only meaning to be found. The absurd hero rebels against the meaninglessness of life by asserting their existence in defiance of the universe's indifference. This rebellion is not a passive resignation, but an active embrace of life in all its uncertainty. According to Camus, there are three possible responses to the absurd: suicide, religion, or revolt. The first response is suicide, the decision to end one's life in the face of life's meaninglessness. This is a form of surrender to the absurd, an attempt to escape the discomfort of confronting the lack of inherent meaning. For Camus, suicide is not a viable option because it denies the very possibility of living authentically in the face of the absurd. The second response is religion, which provides a transcendent framework for meaning and purpose. Many people turn to religion as a way to explain the mysteries of life and find solace in the idea of a divine purpose. However, Camus argues that religion is also a form of escape from the absurd. To turn to religion is to impose a false sense of meaning onto a meaningless universe. It's a way of avoiding the uncomfortable truth that life does not have inherent meaning. The third response, and the one that Camus advocates, is revolt. Revolt involves accepting the absurd and continuing to live fully and authentically in spite of it. This response does not seek to escape the absurd, nor does it attempt to find meaning where there is none. Instead, it embraces life for what it is, a series of experiences without ultimate meaning, and chooses to live with passion, creativity, and awareness. The absurd hero is someone who faces the absurd head-on and refuses to let it diminish their vitality. Camus' idea of revolt is not simply a philosophical position but a way of living. He calls it a rebellion against the absurd, an act of defiance against a universe that offers no inherent purpose. By embracing the absurd, the individual rejects the traditional ways of seeking comfort through meaning, such as religion or suicide, and instead finds freedom in the recognition that life does not have to be anything more than what it is. This freedom, however, comes with a deep sense of responsibility. If life has no inherent meaning, then it is up to each person to create their own meaning through their actions, relationships, and choices. In the myth of Sisyphus, Camus famously states, "One must imagine Sisyphus happy." This paradoxical statement suggests that even in the most futile and absurd of tasks, there is a kind of defiance and purpose that can be found. For Camus, Sisyphus represents the absurd hero because he continues to push the boulder up the hill, knowing full well that it will always roll back down. Yet, it is in this eternal struggle, this continuous effort, that Sisyphus finds meaning. He is not defeated by the absurd, but rather lives fully within it, embracing his fate without resignation. This idea of finding meaning in the struggle is central to absurdism. It's not that life has no meaning, but rather that meaning is not inherent. It is something that we must create for ourselves. In the face of the absurd, the individual has the power to choose how to respond. By living authentically, by continuing to search for meaning and purpose, despite the lack of ultimate answers, we can find a kind of freedom and fulfillment. Absurdism also has significant implications for how we approach human existence. If life is absurd, then we are free from the constraints of an imposed meaning. We can embrace our mortality, our limitations, and the uncertainty of life. There is a sense of liberation in recognizing that we are not bound by a prescribed path, but rather that we have the power to shape our own destinies, even if those destinies ultimately lead nowhere. The meaning we find in life is self-created, not dictated by an external source. In conclusion, absurdism challenges us to confront the uncomfortable truth that life has no inherent meaning. It invites us to accept the absurdity of existence without succumbing to despair or false hopes. By embracing the absurd, we are freed from the need to find transcendent meaning and can instead create our own significance. The absurd hero lives fully and authentically in the face of the meaningless universe, finding freedom and purpose in the struggle itself. Life may be absurd, but it is in this very absurdity that we can find our truest form of freedom and meaning. Phenomenalism is a philosophical theory that asserts that reality is fundamentally composed of perceptions or phenomena, and that objects only exist as they are perceived. In other words, for something to exist, it must be experienced or perceived by a conscious observer. This perspective suggests that the world we experience is not an independent reality, but rather a collection of sensory experiences or phenomena that are dependent on our minds and perceptions. The roots of phenomenalism can be traced to earlier philosophical traditions, particularly the empiricist movement. Philosophers like George Berkeley and Immanuel Kant are often cited as key figures in the development of phenomenalist ideas, though their approaches to the theory vary somewhat. Berkeley, for instance, proposed the idea of idealism, which argued that all things exist only insofar as they are perceived. Kant, on the other hand, introduced a version of phenomenalism through his distinction between phenomena and noumena. While the latter refers to the unknowable reality that exists independently of our perception, the former refers to the world as we experience it, shaped by our senses and cognitive structures. The central claim of phenomenalism is that reality is fundamentally a series of perceptual experiences. Objects do not exist independently of our perception of them. Instead, they exist only as phenomena that are experienced by a conscious observer. According to this view, an object, like a tree, for example, exists in a meaningful way only when it is observed or experienced by someone. Without an observer to perceive it, the tree does not have the same kind of existence. In essence, for phenomenalists, objects are just collections of sensory impressions that are perceived and interpreted by conscious beings. This idea contrasts with other philosophical perspectives, such as realism, which holds that the world exists independently of human perception. Realism asserts that objects continue to exist whether or not they are perceived by any conscious being. In contrast, phenomenalism denies the independent existence of objects and instead asserts that the perception of an object is what gives it meaning and reality. The object is not thought to possess any intrinsic qualities apart from the way it is perceived by the observer. One of the key challenges of phenomenalism is understanding how we can make sense of the apparent stability and consistency of the world around us, even when we are not directly perceiving it. For instance, if a tree falls in a forest and no one is around to hear it, does it make a sound? Phenomenalists would argue that the sound exists as a perception, but without a conscious observer, the sound does not exist in the way we conventionally think of it. This view can be seen as raising questions about the nature of reality and whether our understanding of it is limited by our sensory experiences. To address such concerns, some versions of phenomenalism adopt a more sophisticated view of the relationship between perception and reality. For instance, one possible answer to the tree falling question is that objects do not vanish entirely when they are not being observed, but rather exist as potential experiences. The tree, even when it is not being directly perceived, still exists as a set of potential sensory experiences that could be activated if an observer were present. This way of thinking allows for the idea that objects have a kind of virtual existence, one that is tied to the possibility of perception rather than actual independent existence. Phenomenalism also introduces the concept of phenomenal properties, which are the qualities of objects as they are perceived. For example, the color, shape, and texture of an object are all considered to be phenomenal properties because they are dependent on the way the object is perceived. These properties are not thought to be inherent in the object itself, but are the result of the interaction between the object and the perceiving subject. This concept leads to the idea that the world we experience is, in a sense, constructed by the mind through sensory input, and that our experience of the world is inseparable from the ways in which we perceive it. This leads to a key issue in the study of phenomenalism: the problem of object permanence. Object permanence is the understanding that objects continue to exist even when they are not being directly perceived. For example, a person knows that a car parked outside still exists even when they are not looking at it. Phenomenalists have to grapple with how to explain this kind of continuity in a world where objects exist only as perceptions. One way to address this is to argue that even when objects are not perceived, they still exist as potential experiences that could occur if an observer were present. This allows for the continuity of objects across time and space, even if they are not always being directly perceived. Despite these challenges, phenomenalism has several significant implications for how we understand the nature of reality and our place in it. By focusing on perception as the basis of reality, phenomenalism highlights the central role that the mind plays in shaping our experience of the world. This perspective suggests that our understanding of reality is not a direct reflection of an independent, objective world, but rather a construction that is shaped by the limitations and abilities of our senses. In this way, phenomenalism shifts the focus away from an external, objective reality and toward the subjective experiences of the individual. Moreover, phenomenalism also raises important questions about the nature of knowledge and how we come to know the world around us. If reality is fundamentally composed of perceptions, then our knowledge of the world is always mediated by our sensory experiences. This implies that all knowledge is ultimately grounded in perception, and that our understanding of reality is limited by the range and accuracy of our senses. This view of knowledge can be seen as part of the broader empiricist tradition, which emphasizes the role of experience and sensory data in the formation of knowledge. One of the strengths of phenomenalism is that it provides a way of reconciling the subjectivity of perception with the apparent objectivity of the world. By suggesting that objects only exist as they are perceived, phenomenalism offers a framework for understanding how individuals can experience a shared reality, despite the fact that each person's perception of the world is subjective. In this way, phenomenalism allows for a kind of intersubjectivity, where different individuals can share common experiences of the world, even if those experiences are shaped by their individual sensory perceptions. However, phenomenalism also faces significant criticisms. One of the main criticisms is that it leads to a form of idealism, in which reality is entirely dependent on the mind and its perceptions. Critics argue that this view seems to undermine the objectivity of the world and reduces everything to a subjective construction. Another criticism is that phenomenalism seems to ignore the role of the external world in shaping our perceptions. While it may be true that objects are perceived through sensory experience, many philosophers argue that the world itself must have some kind of objective reality that exists independently of our perception of it. In conclusion, phenomenalism offers a unique and provocative way of thinking about the nature of reality, emphasizing the central role of perception in shaping our experience of the world. By asserting that objects exist only insofar as they are perceived, phenomenalism challenges traditional ideas about the independence of reality and highlights the ways in which our perceptions construct the world around us. Despite its challenges and criticisms, phenomenalism continues to be an important philosophical theory that raises fundamental questions about the relationship between the mind, perception, and reality. Compatibilism is a philosophical theory that seeks to reconcile the concept of free will with the idea of determinism. Determinism is the view that every event, including human actions, is the result of prior causes and is therefore inevitable. According to this view, the future is determined by the present and past conditions of the world, meaning that every decision we make is shaped by factors outside of our control, such as our biology, environment, and past experiences. On the other hand, free will is the idea that individuals have the capacity to make choices that are not determined by external forces or prior causes, allowing them to act independently of the natural laws that govern the universe. Compatibilists argue that free will and determinism are not mutually exclusive, and that it is possible for both to coexist. They assert that individuals can still be considered free in their decision-making, even if their actions are determined by prior causes. The key to understanding compatibilism is recognizing that free will, according to compatibilists, does not necessarily mean the ability to make choices that are entirely free from any influence or constraint. Instead, free will is understood in a way that is compatible with the deterministic nature of the universe. One of the central concepts in compatibilism is the idea of freedom to act according to one's desires. Compatibilists believe that an individual can be considered free as long as they are able to act in accordance with their internal desires, preferences, and motivations, even if these desires themselves are shaped by external factors. In this view, freedom is not about being able to choose from an unlimited range of options or acting without any influence from the environment or past experiences. Rather, it is about being able to act in a way that reflects one's own desires and reasons, without being coerced or constrained by external forces. For example, imagine a person who is faced with the decision of whether to go to a party or stay home. A compatibilist would argue that as long as the person is able to make the decision based on their own preferences and desires, whether they want to socialize or relax at home, then they are acting freely, even if those preferences are influenced by their past experiences, personality, and environment. The person is still free because they are able to make the decision in accordance with their desires, even if those desires are not entirely self-generated or independent of external causes. In contrast, a more traditional or libertarian view of free will might argue that true freedom requires the ability to make choices that are not determined by any prior causes, including one's desires or external influences. According to this view, if a person's decision is influenced by factors like biology or past experiences, then their actions are not truly free. Libertarians, who oppose determinism, would argue that for a person to have free will, they must have the ability to choose otherwise in any given situation, independent of any external factors or prior causes. This notion of free will is often referred to as ultimate responsibility, where individuals are seen as the ultimate originators of their actions, unaffected by prior events. Compatibilists, however, maintain that this stronger notion of free will is not necessary for moral responsibility or personal freedom. They argue that as long as individuals can act according to their own desires and intentions, they can be held accountable for their actions, even if those desires are themselves shaped by prior causes. In this sense, compatibilists reject the idea that free will requires the ability to have acted differently in a given situation. Instead, they argue that the freedom to act in accordance with one's desires is sufficient for moral responsibility. One important distinction made by compatibilists is between freedom from coercion and freedom of action. According to compatibilism, individuals are free as long as they are not coerced or forced into making a particular choice. For example, if someone is threatened with violence unless they do something, they are not free to act according to their desires, because their actions are being coerced by an external force. However, if an individual is able to make a decision without external coercion, even if that decision is influenced by prior causes such as their upbringing or environment, then they can still be said to be acting freely. In this way, compatibilism focuses on the freedom to act in accordance with one's internal motivations and desires, rather than the freedom to act without any influences or constraints at all. A common criticism of compatibilism is that it does not truly address the problem of free will. Critics argue that by redefining free will as the freedom to act in accordance with one's desires, compatibilism does not solve the underlying problem of determinism. If every decision is ultimately the result of prior causes, then critics contend that individuals are still not free in any meaningful sense. According to this view, even though people may act in line with their desires, those desires themselves are determined by factors beyond their control, such as genetics, upbringing, or social conditioning. As a result, the argument goes, compatibilism fails to account for genuine freedom, since the individual is still bound by the causal chain of events that led to their desires and decisions. Another objection to compatibilism is that it seems to downplay the significance of the philosophical debate about free will. Critics argue that compatibilism merely redefines free will in a way that makes it compatible with determinism, without addressing the deeper issue of whether individuals can truly be responsible for their actions if those actions are determined by prior causes. If everything is determined by prior causes, they argue, then there is no room for genuine moral responsibility, because individuals cannot be said to have chosen their actions in any meaningful way. Despite these criticisms, compatibilism remains a widely accepted view in contemporary philosophy. Many compatibilists argue that the debate over free will and determinism is not about whether or not determinism is true, but about how we can understand human freedom and moral responsibility in a deterministic world. They contend that we can still hold individuals accountable for their actions, even if those actions are determined by prior causes, as long as the individuals are able to act in accordance with their own desires and intentions. One of the most influential compatibilists in the modern era is philosopher Daniel Dennett. Dennett argues that free will should be understood as the ability to make decisions based on reasoning and reflection, rather than as the ability to act independently of any prior causes. He believes that while our actions are determined by prior causes, we are still capable of exercising a form of freedom that allows us to make decisions based on our desires and reasoning. Dennett also argues that understanding free will in this way is crucial for our understanding of morality and personal responsibility. In conclusion, compatibilism is a philosophical theory that seeks to reconcile the concepts of free will and determinism. It argues that individuals can still be free and morally responsible for their actions, even if those actions are determined by prior causes. According to compatibilists, freedom does not require the ability to make choices that are entirely independent of any external influences, but rather the ability to act in accordance with one's desires and motivations. While compatibilism has faced criticism for redefining free will in a way that does not address the deeper issues of moral responsibility, it remains a significant and widely accepted position in contemporary philosophy, offering a way to understand human freedom in a deterministic universe. Determinism is a philosophical theory that asserts that every event or state of affairs, including human actions and decisions, is the result of preceding causes and is thus inevitable. This view holds that the universe operates according to strict causal laws, meaning that everything that happens is determined by prior events. In other words, the state of the world at any given moment is a direct consequence of previous conditions and the laws of nature that govern those conditions. From this perspective, the future is entirely shaped by the present and past, and every event that occurs is a necessary outcome of preceding events. At its core, determinism suggests that the universe is a closed system where everything that happens follows a predetermined path. If we had complete knowledge of the state of the world at any given time and understood all the causal laws governing the universe, we would be able to predict every event that will happen in the future. This idea challenges the notion of free will, which asserts that humans have the ability to make independent choices that are not determined by prior causes. In a deterministic universe, every choice, action, and event is seen as the inevitable outcome of preceding causes, leaving no room for true spontaneity or alternative possibilities. The roots of determinism can be traced back to ancient philosophy, but it became more fully developed with the rise of scientific thinking. One of the key influences on modern determinism was the work of Isaac Newton, whose laws of motion and gravitation suggested that the natural world operates according to predictable, causal laws. According to Newtonian physics, if we knew the position and velocity of every particle in the universe at a given time, we could predict all future events. This idea, known as Laplace's demon, proposed that if a hypothetical being, Laplace's demon, had complete knowledge of the state of the universe, it would be able to predict the future with complete certainty. However, the development of quantum mechanics in the 20th century complicated the deterministic view of the universe. Quantum mechanics, the branch of physics that deals with subatomic particles, introduced the concept of indeterminacy, which suggests that at the quantum level, some events do not have deterministic outcomes, but instead occur probabilistically. This introduced the possibility that not all events in the universe are determined by prior causes, raising questions about the validity of determinism. Despite this, many philosophers and scientists continue to debate whether determinism is true at the macroscopic level of human experience, or whether the randomness observed at the quantum level can be reconciled with the broader concept of a deterministic universe. In the context of human behavior, determinism suggests that our actions, thoughts, and decisions are the result of a complex web of prior causes. These causes can include our genetics, upbringing, environment, and past experiences. According to this view, individuals do not have the ability to make free choices. Rather, their actions are determined by the sum of all previous influences. For example, a person might make a decision to pursue a particular career, but according to determinism, that decision is shaped by their personality, the education they received, their socioeconomic background, and a host of other factors beyond their control. Even the person's desires, preferences, and values are determined by prior causes, making the idea of free will irrelevant in a deterministic universe. One of the central implications of determinism is its challenge to the concept of moral responsibility. If every action is determined by prior causes, then it can be difficult to hold individuals morally accountable for their behavior. If a person's actions are the result of factors beyond their control, such as their upbringing or genetic predispositions, can they truly be held responsible for their choices? This problem is known as the problem of moral responsibility, and has been a major topic of debate in the philosophy of determinism. Some philosophers argue that moral responsibility can still be maintained in a deterministic universe, even if our actions are determined by prior causes. This is the position taken by compatibilists who argue that free will and determinism can coexist. According to compatibilism, individuals can still be held morally responsible for their actions, as long as they are able to act in accordance with their desires and motivations, even if those desires are shaped by prior causes. In other words, as long as a person is not coerced or forced into making a particular choice, they can be considered responsible for their actions, even if those actions are determined by prior causes. However, critics of determinism argue that if our actions are determined by factors beyond our control, then true moral responsibility is an illusion. If we cannot choose our desires or control the circumstances that shape our decisions, then it becomes difficult to see how we can be held accountable for our behavior. This raises important ethical questions about punishment, justice, and the nature of human agency. Another important implication of determinism is its impact on the concept of personal identity and the sense of self. If our actions and choices are determined by prior causes, it calls into question the nature of the self as an independent, autonomous agent. Some philosophers argue that the self is merely an illusion, a byproduct of the complex interactions between our biology, environment, and experiences. According to this view, the individual is not the ultimate originator of their actions, but rather a product of external forces. This challenges the notion of personal agency and raises questions about the nature of identity and the extent to which we can truly control our lives. Determinism also has implications for the way we understand human psychology and behavior. If our actions are determined by prior causes, then our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors can be seen as the result of a complex web of causal influences. This view suggests that human behavior is predictable to some extent, based on the individual's past experiences, genetics, and environmental factors. In this sense, determinism can provide a framework for understanding why people behave the way they do, and can inform fields like psychology, sociology, and criminology. One of the key criticisms of determinism is that it undermines the concept of freedom and autonomy. If all events are determined by prior causes, then individuals have no true control over their actions, and the idea of making free choices becomes meaningless. This view challenges the traditional notion of moral responsibility, as it suggests that individuals cannot be held accountable for actions that are determined by factors beyond their control. Critics of determinism argue that if human behavior is entirely determined, then the concepts of praise, blame, and punishment lose their significance. In response to this criticism, some proponents of determinism argue that even if our actions are determined, we can still make meaningful decisions and exercise control over our lives. This view suggests that while our actions may be influenced by prior causes, we still have the capacity to reason, reflect, and make choices that align with our values and goals. In this sense, determinism does not necessarily negate the possibility of meaningful action or moral responsibility, but rather redefines what it means to be free. In conclusion, determinism is a philosophical theory that asserts that all events, including human actions and decisions, are determined by prior causes and are inevitable. While it presents significant challenges to the concept of free will and moral responsibility, it also offers a framework for understanding human behavior and the nature of the universe. Determinism raises important ethical questions about the nature of responsibility, punishment, and justice, and it forces us to reconsider traditional notions of personal agency and autonomy. Despite its challenges, determinism remains a central topic in philosophy, science, and ethics, and continues to provoke debates about the extent to which our lives are shaped by factors beyond our control. Fatalism is a philosophical view that holds that events and outcomes are predetermined and unavoidable, regardless of human actions or decisions. According to this perspective, the future is already set, and everything that happens, including human choices, is fated to occur as it is meant to. Fatalism suggests that individuals have little to no control over their destinies, as everything that occurs is part of an inevitable chain of events that cannot be altered by human agency. At the heart of fatalism is the belief that the universe is governed by forces or a predetermined plan that makes certain events and outcomes inevitable. Unlike determinism, which argues that the future is determined by prior causes, fatalism asserts that the outcome of events is set regardless of what actions are taken. In other words, even if individuals make decisions or try to alter their circumstances, the ultimate outcome will always be the same, because it has been predestined or fated to happen. One key feature of fatalism is its emphasis on the inevitability of outcomes. Fatalists believe that no matter what choices individuals make, they are bound to follow a certain path that leads to predetermined outcomes. This perspective often implies that human efforts to change or influence the course of events are futile, because everything that happens is part of a larger, unchangeable plan. The idea of everything happens for a reason often reflects a fatalistic outlook, where events, whether good or bad, are seen as part of a grand scheme beyond human control. The roots of fatalism can be found in various religious and philosophical traditions. In ancient Greece, the idea of fate was central to the worldview of the gods and their control over human lives. The concept of fate was famously represented by the three fates in Greek mythology, who were said to spin, measure, and cut the thread of life for every individual. According to this belief, a person's life was determined by the fates, and there was little that could be done to change one's predetermined destiny. Similarly, in other ancient cultures and religions, such as Norse mythology and Hinduism, fate played a key role in determining the course of human lives and the universe. In the context of modern philosophy, fatalism is often discussed in relation to the problem of free will. If everything is predetermined and inevitable, then what role do human choices and actions play? Fatalism raises questions about the nature of personal responsibility and moral agency. If individuals are not free to choose their actions and are instead following a predetermined path, can they be held accountable for their decisions? This question has profound implications for ethics and the justice system, as it challenges the idea of individual responsibility and the concept of personal autonomy. One of the main criticisms of fatalism is that it leads to a kind of passivity or resignation. If everything is fated to happen, then why bother making any effort to change or improve one's life? Fatalism can promote a sense of helplessness, where individuals believe that their actions are irrelevant because the outcome is already determined. This can lead to a lack of motivation and a diminished sense of agency, as people may feel that their choices do not matter in the grand scheme of things. In contrast, many philosophical traditions emphasize the importance of human agency and the ability to make meaningful choices. For example, existentialist philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre rejected the idea of fatalism, arguing that individuals are responsible for creating their own meaning and purpose in life. Sartre believed that humans are condemned to be free, meaning that they are always faced with the responsibility of making choices, even in the face of uncertainty and existential challenges. From this perspective, fatalism's emphasis on inevitability is seen as a denial of human freedom and creativity. Fatalism also raises important questions about the nature of time and the relationship between the past, present, and future. In a fatalistic worldview, the future is already set, and the past and present are merely part of the unfolding of a predetermined story. This view challenges the more conventional understanding of time, where events are seen as contingent and subject to change based on human choices. If the future is already determined, then the idea of free will and the possibility of changing the course of events becomes irrelevant. Some versions of fatalism are tied to theological beliefs about divine providence and predestination. In many religious traditions, fatalism is closely associated with the idea that a higher power, such as God, has a plan for the universe, and that everything that happens is part of this divine plan. In Christianity, for example, the doctrine of predestination holds that God has already chosen who will be saved and who will be damned, and that this decision is not influenced by human actions or choices. Similarly, in some strands of Islam, fatalism is linked to the belief that God's will determines all aspects of the universe, and that human beings must submit to God's plan. Despite the religious associations of fatalism, it is also possible to adopt a secular form of fatalism, which does not rely on the existence of a divine being or a higher power. In this view, fatalism is understood as the belief that the course of events is determined by natural laws or forces, such as the laws of physics or the unfolding of the universe. This perspective suggests that everything, including human actions and decisions, is governed by these laws, and that the future is inevitable based on the current state of the world. One of the most well-known philosophical arguments against fatalism is the paradox of fatalism. This paradox arises when we consider the implications of fatalism for human choice. If everything is predetermined, then it seems that no matter what choices we make, the outcome will always be the same. However, if the outcome is already determined, it suggests that we are not truly free to make our own choices, because the choices we make will always lead to the same predetermined outcome. This creates a tension between the idea of free will and the idea of fate, and it raises the question of how both concepts can coexist. One way that some philosophers have tried to resolve this paradox is by distinguishing between different types of determinism. For example, some argue that while the universe may be deterministic at the physical level, human beings still have a kind of freedom at the psychological or moral level. This view, known as compatibilism, suggests that even if the universe is deterministic, individuals can still be considered free as long as they are able to act according to their desires and motivations, rather than being coerced or constrained by external forces. Another possible response to fatalism is to argue that while some events may be predetermined, there are still areas of human life where individuals have genuine freedom and agency. This view suggests that while certain aspects of the universe may be governed by fate, there are still opportunities for personal choice and responsibility within the scope of human existence. In conclusion, fatalism is a philosophical perspective that asserts that all events and outcomes are predetermined and inevitable, regardless of human actions. Fatalism challenges the idea of free will and raises important questions about moral responsibility, human agency and the nature of time. While some versions of fatalism are rooted in religious or theological beliefs, others adopt a secular approach, viewing the universe as governed by natural laws. Despite its challenges, fatalism continues to provoke debate about the role of human choice in a universe that may be governed by forces beyond our control. Epistemic relativism is a philosophical position that suggests knowledge, truth, or justification are not absolute, but are instead relative to particular frameworks, cultures, languages, or perspectives. According to epistemic relativism, what counts as knowledge or truth can vary across different societies, contexts, or conceptual schemes, and there is no universal or objective standard by which all claims to knowledge or truth can be judged. In this view, different epistemic systems, such as scientific, religious, or cultural ways of knowing, may each be valid within their own context but are not universally applicable across all perspectives. The central tenet of epistemic relativism is that the standards for what is considered true or justified depend on the particular framework or worldview from which one is approaching a question. In this sense, truth is not viewed as an objective feature of the world that exists independently of human cognition, but rather as something that is constructed through human practices and cultural contexts. The view challenges the notion that there is a single, objective reality that can be known in the same way by all individuals, regardless of their cultural or social background. Epistemic relativism is often discussed in relation to other forms of relativism, such as moral relativism, which suggests that moral truths are relative to cultures or individuals. Similarly, epistemic relativism holds that there are no universally applicable methods of justification or criteria of truth. What is considered rational or justified in one context may be seen as irrational or unjustified in another. For example, a scientific explanation might be considered valid within the scientific community, but it might be viewed with skepticism or rejection by individuals from a different cultural or religious background. According to epistemic relativism, both perspectives may be valid within their respective frameworks. One of the most prominent arguments for epistemic relativism comes from the observation that different cultures and traditions often have differing beliefs about what counts as knowledge or truth. For instance, in different societies, various forms of reasoning and forms of evidence may be emphasized. In some cultures, religious or spiritual experiences might be considered valid sources of knowledge, while in others, empirical scientific evidence may hold more weight. Epistemic relativists argue that these different ways of knowing should be understood as equally legitimate, as each is based on its own set of assumptions and criteria for knowledge. One example of this is the contrast between Western scientific knowledge and indigenous knowledge systems. While Western science emphasizes empirical observation, experimentation, and rational reasoning, indigenous knowledge may rely more on oral traditions, spirituality, and lived experience. Epistemic relativism would hold that both of these knowledge systems are valid in their respective contexts, even if they are based on different ways of understanding and interpreting the world. From this perspective, neither system can claim to be superior or more true than the other, because they are based on different, culturally specific epistemic practices. Critics of epistemic relativism argue that it leads to a form of epistemic paralysis or nihilism, where no knowledge claim can be truly evaluated or compared across different frameworks. If all knowledge claims are relative to particular perspectives or cultural systems, then it becomes difficult, if not impossible, to make judgments about the truth or falsity of claims across different epistemic systems. For example, if one cultural system holds that the Earth is flat and another holds that the Earth is round, an epistemic relativist might argue that both perspectives are valid within their own frameworks, making it difficult to determine which one corresponds to objective reality. Critics argue that this undermines the possibility of objective truth and rational discourse. One of the key concerns about epistemic relativism is its potential to undermine the idea of objective standards of reasoning and evidence. If knowledge is entirely relative to specific frameworks, then the very idea of rational argumentation becomes questionable. In this view, reasoning is no longer about discovering objective truths, but is instead about constructing knowledge that is consistent within a particular set of beliefs or practices. This could lead to a situation where all epistemic systems are seen as equally valid, even if some of them rely on methods or principles that are inconsistent or flawed by certain standards. Another criticism of epistemic relativism comes from the charge that it is self-defeating or incoherent. If epistemic relativism is true, then the claim that knowledge is relative to different frameworks must itself be seen as relative to the particular framework within which it is expressed. This creates a paradox because if the relativist's own position is relative, then it cannot be universally true. In other words, if all knowledge claims are relative, then the relativist's claim that all knowledge is relative must also be relative, undermining its own validity. Despite these criticisms, epistemic relativism has been defended by some philosophers who argue that it is a necessary recognition of the diversity of human thought and practice. These defenders suggest that the recognition of different epistemic frameworks is not a denial of objective truth, but an acknowledgement that our understanding of the world is shaped by our social, historical, and cultural contexts. In this view, knowledge is not simply about uncovering a universal set of facts, but about interpreting and making sense of the world in ways that are meaningful within particular contexts. One of the most prominent figures associated with epistemic relativism is the philosopher Thomas Kuhn. In his influential work, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, Kuhn argued that scientific knowledge is not a cumulative process of discovering objective truths, but rather a series of paradigm shifts in which entire frameworks of understanding are replaced by new, incommensurable paradigms. According to Kuhn, scientific communities operate within particular paradigms, and these paradigms shape the way that knowledge is understood and justified. When a new paradigm replaces an old one, it does not necessarily represent a more accurate or objective truth, but rather a different way of interpreting and making sense of the world. This view suggests that knowledge is relative to the specific paradigm or framework within which it is produced. Similarly, Michel Foucault's work on epistemology and power structures suggests that knowledge is not neutral, but is shaped by social and political forces. Foucault argued that different forms of knowledge are produced by particular historical and cultural contexts, and that knowledge itself is a form of power. According to Foucault, the way we understand and categorize the world is deeply influenced by social structures and institutions, and these systems of knowledge are not objective reflections of reality, but rather constructions that serve particular interests. In this way, epistemic relativism can be seen as a way of highlighting the ways in which knowledge is contingent upon the historical and cultural contexts in which it is produced. Another way in which epistemic relativism has been defended is by appealing to the notion of epistemic communities. These are groups of people who share a common set of beliefs, practices, and methods for acquiring knowledge. Epistemic relativists argue that knowledge is always produced within such communities, and that each community has its own set of norms and standards for determining what counts as justified belief or knowledge. These communities are often shaped by cultural, historical, and social factors, and the standards for knowledge within each community may differ significantly. Epistemic relativism, in this view, is simply a recognition of the diversity of epistemic communities and the validity of their ways of knowing. In conclusion, epistemic relativism is the view that knowledge, truth, and justification are not absolute, but are relative to particular frameworks, cultures, or perspectives. It challenges the idea of universal, objective standards of knowledge and emphasizes the diversity of ways in which humans understand and interpret the world. While epistemic relativism has been criticized for leading to paradoxes or undermining the possibility of objective truth, it has also been defended as an important recognition of the social and cultural factors that shape human understanding. Ultimately, epistemic relativism highlights the complex and context-dependent nature of knowledge, raising important questions about the nature of truth, justification, and rationality. Philosophical zombies, often referred to simply as zombies in philosophical discourse, are hypothetical beings used in discussions about the nature of consciousness, the mind-body problem, and the hard problem of consciousness. These creatures are central to debates in philosophy of mind, particularly in arguments about whether consciousness can be fully explained by physical processes, or whether there is something inherently subjective and non-physical about the experience of being conscious. The idea of philosophical zombies was popularized by philosopher David Chalmers in the 1990s as part of his argument for the hard problem of consciousness, which is the problem of explaining why and how subjective experiences, or qualia, arise from physical processes in the brain. Philosophical zombies are imagined to be identical to human beings in every way, including in their behavior, physical structure, and neurological functioning. They act and react in the same way as normal humans, but they lack any subjective experience. In other words, while they may appear to be conscious and responsive to stimuli, they do not actually feel anything. To illustrate this, imagine a philosophical zombie walking down the street. It interacts with its environment, avoids obstacles, and responds to sensory stimuli just like a normal person would. However, according to the zombie thought experiment, the zombie has no inner experience of what it is like to walk down the street, hear the sounds around it, or experience any sensations. It is a purely functional being, behaving as if it is conscious, but without the subjective experience that accompanies consciousness in humans. This thought experiment is designed to challenge the assumption that consciousness can be fully explained by physical or functional processes. The central question that philosophical zombies raise is whether consciousness is something over and above the physical processes that occur in the brain. If it is possible for a being to function exactly like a human being in every respect, but still lack subjective experience, then this would suggest that consciousness cannot be entirely explained by physical processes or the functioning of the brain. In other words, it would point to the possibility that there is something more to consciousness than what can be observed and measured scientifically. The idea of philosophical zombies is often used to argue against physicalism, the view that everything, including consciousness, can be explained by physical processes. Physicalism holds that all mental states, including consciousness, are reducible to physical states of the brain, and that once we understand the brain's processes, we will have a complete understanding of consciousness. Philosophical zombies challenge this view by suggesting that it is conceivable that consciousness is something non-physical, since the zombie has all the physical features of a conscious being but lacks subjective experience. For example, a zombie might have a brain that functions exactly like a human brain, with the same neural circuits firing in response to stimuli, the same patterns of thought and behavior, and the same reactions to external events. Despite all of this, the zombie would not have any internal experience of these processes. It would not feel pain when it is hurt, nor would it experience the color red when it sees a red object. Its behavior would be indistinguishable from that of a conscious human, but it would not have the inner experience that humans associate with being conscious. Chalmers and other proponents of the zombie thought experiment use it to argue for what is known as dualism, the idea that consciousness is not reducible to physical processes, but rather involves some non-physical or mental substance. According to dualism, consciousness is a distinct property or aspect of the mind that cannot be fully explained by the workings of the brain alone. This view stands in contrast to physicalist or materialist accounts of consciousness, which claim that all mental phenomena, including consciousness, are the result of physical interactions between neurons and other elements of the brain. The philosophical zombie argument also highlights what is known as the explanatory gap in the philosophy of mind. The explanatory gap refers to the difficulty in explaining how subjective experiences, the what it's like aspect of consciousness, arise from physical processes. While we can observe and measure the neural activity associated with perception, thought, and action, it remains unclear how these physical processes translate into the subjective experience of being conscious. Philosophical zombies are used to highlight this gap by suggesting that it is conceivable for a being to have all the same physical processes as a conscious human, but still lack subjective experience. Critics of the philosophical zombie thought experiment argue that it is a flawed or unrealistic way of exploring the nature of consciousness. Some philosophers suggest that the notion of a being that is physically identical to a conscious human but lacks subjective experience is incoherent. After all, if a being is functionally identical to a conscious person, it might be difficult to see how it could lack the very subjective experiences that define consciousness. Others argue that the thought experiment is an unhelpful or irrelevant way to address the problem of consciousness, as it relies on an intuition about the nature of experience that may not be grounded in scientific evidence or empirical observation. One prominent counterargument to the philosophical zombie thought experiment is based on the idea of functionalism. Functionalism is the view that mental states, including consciousness, are defined by their functional roles, that is, by the ways they interact with other mental states and produce behavior. According to functionalism, it is not necessary for a being to have a subjective experience in order to be conscious, as long as it exhibits the right functional properties. In other words, if a philosophical zombie behaves exactly like a human, with the same responses to stimuli and the same patterns of neural activity, then it might be considered to have the same mental states as a human, including consciousness. From this perspective, the zombie thought experiment does not show that consciousness is non-physical, but rather that consciousness can be fully explained in terms of function and behavior. Another response to the zombie argument comes from proponents of panpsychism, a view that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the universe, present in all matter, even at the most basic level. Panpsychists argue that consciousness is not something that emerges from complex physical systems like the brain, but is instead an intrinsic property of all physical matter. From this perspective, the idea of a philosophical zombie is problematic, because it assumes that consciousness is something that can be missing from a being's physical processes. Instead, panpsychists believe that consciousness is already present in all aspects of the universe, and that the challenge is to understand how it manifests in more complex organisms like humans. Despite the criticisms, the philosophical zombie thought experiment remains a powerful tool in the philosophy of mind, particularly for those who argue that consciousness cannot be fully explained by physical or functional processes. By presenting a scenario in which a being behaves identically to a human but lacks subjective experience, the zombie argument challenges the assumption that consciousness is simply the result of physical interactions in the brain. It forces philosophers to confront the hard problem of consciousness, the question of why and how subjective experience arises from physical processes, and encourages further exploration of the nature of the mind. In conclusion, philosophical zombies are hypothetical beings used to explore the nature of a consciousness and the mind-body problem. They are imagined to be physically identical to humans but lack subjective experience. The zombie thought experiment is often used to challenge physicalism and highlight the hard problem of consciousness, which is the difficulty of explaining how subjective experience arises from physical processes. While some philosophers criticize the thought experiment as incoherent or unhelpful, others see it as a valuable tool for investigating the nature of consciousness and the limits of physicalist explanations. Ultimately, the debate over philosophical zombies underscores the complexity and mystery of consciousness, a problem that continues to engage philosophers and scientists alike. Functionalism is a theory in the philosophy of mind that holds that mental states are defined by their functional roles, rather than by their intrinsic physical or qualitative properties. According to functionalism, what makes something a mental state, such as a belief, desire, or pain, is not its specific physical makeup, e.g., the neurons or chemical processes that give rise to it, but rather the way it functions or interacts with other mental states, sensory inputs, and behavioral outputs. In other words, mental states are identified by the role they play in the overall system of cognition and behavior, not by the particular substance or process that realizes them. The central idea behind functionalism is that mental states are not tied to a specific type of material or biological substrate. While traditional views of the mind, such as dualism and identity theory, focus on the nature of the underlying material or substance of mental states, functionalism argues that what is important is how mental states fit into the larger system of an organism's behavior and cognitive processes. For functionalists, any system that exhibits the right functional organization can have mental states, even if its physical makeup is different from that of humans. This means that functionalism allows for the possibility of artificial intelligence or machines having mental states, as long as they exhibit the right functional relationships. One of the key figures in the development of functionalism is philosopher Hilary Putnam. In the 1960s, Putnam introduced the concept of functionalism as a response to the limitations of earlier theories, such as behaviorism and identity theory. Behaviorism, for instance, argued that mental states should be understood in terms of observable behavior, while identity theory suggested that mental states are identical to brain states. Functionalism, by contrast, offers a more flexible approach, suggesting that mental states are defined by their role in the system, regardless of the specific physical or behavioral form they take. Putnam famously used the multiple realizability argument to support functionalism. The idea of multiple realizability is the claim that the same mental state can be realized by different physical systems. For example, the mental state of pain could be realized by the specific neural processes in a human brain, but it could also be realized by entirely different physical systems, such as the cognitive systems of an octopus or an artificial intelligence. According to functionalism, the key is not the particular substance or material that realizes the mental state, but the functional role it plays in the system. For instance, the mental state of pain might be defined by its functional role in the organism's overall system, its connection to certain inputs, such as tissue damage, its connection to other mental states, such as a desire to avoid further injury, and its connection to behavioral outputs, such as vocalizing or withdrawing from the painful stimulus. Whether this mental state is realized by neurons in a human brain, by the nervous system of another animal, or by an artificial system does not matter as long as the same functional role is played. This allows for the possibility of non-biological systems, such as robots or computers, having mental states, provided they exhibit the same functional organization. Another important aspect of functionalism is its contrast with the mind-body problem, particularly the question of how mental states, such as thoughts and feelings, relate to physical states, such as brain activity. Traditional theories like dualism and identity theory struggle to explain how mental states can arise from purely physical states, or how two different substances, the mind and the body can interact. Functionalism, however, avoids these problems by focusing on the causal relationships between mental states, inputs, and outputs, rather than trying to explain the mind-body interaction in terms of substance or material. Mental states, according to functionalism, are simply functional states that perform certain roles in the overall system of cognition and behavior, and they are defined by the way they relate to other states within the system. In its simplest form, functionalism is often described by the analogy to a computer. Just as the function of a computer program is determined by the relationships between different parts of the program and the hardware it runs on, rather than by the specific physical components of the computer, mental states are determined by the relationships between different cognitive and behavioral processes. For example, the mental state of belief might be defined by its causal relations with sensory inputs, such as perceiving a cat. Its role in other mental states, such as desires to interact with the cat, and its causal role in behavior, such as the decision to pet the cat. Functionalism has gained widespread acceptance among philosophers of mind because it offers a way to explain the nature of mental states without relying on the specific physical structure of the brain. It also allows for the possibility of artificial intelligence and machine consciousness, since functionalism does not require that mental states be realized by biological processes. This makes functionalism an appealing theory in the context of the development of AI and robotics, where the goal is to create machines that exhibit human-like behavior and cognition. However, functionalism also faces several important criticisms. One of the most well-known criticisms comes from philosopher John Searle, who developed the Chinese room argument. Searle's argument challenges the idea that functionalism can fully explain consciousness and understanding. The Chinese room thought experiment involves a person who does not speak Chinese being placed in a room with a set of instructions for manipulating Chinese symbols. The person is able to produce correct responses to questions in Chinese by following the instructions, but they do not understand the meaning of the symbols. Searle argues that this demonstrates that a system can exhibit functional behavior, such as understanding Chinese, without actually having any real understanding or consciousness. In other words, Searle suggests that functionalism may explain behavior, but it does not explain subjective experience or consciousness. Functionalists typically respond to this criticism by arguing that the Chinese room argument does not take into account the larger system or organization of the brain and mind. They suggest that understanding is not simply a matter of manipulating symbols according to rules, but involves the integration of multiple cognitive processes and interactions between mental states. According to functionalism, consciousness arises from the functional organization of the system as a whole, rather than from any one isolated process or component. Another criticism of functionalism comes from the challenge of specifying the exact functional roles of mental states. While functionalism is a flexible and general theory, some critics argue that it is difficult to specify the exact functional relationships that define particular mental states. For example, it is unclear how the functional role of a particular belief or desire can be described in precise terms that apply across different systems, biological or artificial. Furthermore, functionalism faces the problem of completeness, which is the difficulty of identifying all the relevant functional roles that a mental state might play. Critics argue that without a precise understanding of these functional relationships, functionalism may be too vague or incomplete to provide a full explanation of consciousness and mental life. Despite these criticisms, functionalism remains one of the most prominent theories in contemporary philosophy of mind. It offers a way to explain mental states that is flexible and compatible with the possibility of artificial intelligence and machine consciousness. It also provides a way to avoid some of the problems associated with earlier theories, such as dualism and identity theory, by focusing on the functional roles of mental states rather than their specific physical or material makeup. As such, functionalism continues to be a central theory in debates about the nature of consciousness, the mind-body problem, and the potential for machine cognition. In conclusion, functionalism is a theory in the philosophy of mind that defines mental states by their functional roles rather than by their physical or qualitative properties. According to functionalism, mental states are characterized by the way they interact with other mental states, sensory inputs, and behavioral outputs. The theory has been influential in shaping debates about the mind-body problem, the nature of consciousness, and the possibility of artificial intelligence. While functionalism has its critics, it remains a widely accepted view in contemporary philosophy of mind and provides an important framework for understanding mental processes and cognition. Behaviorism is a school of thought in psychology and philosophy that emphasizes the study of observable behavior rather than internal mental states or processes. In behaviorism, mental states, consciousness, and other subjective experiences are considered unnecessary or even irrelevant for explaining behavior. Instead, behaviorists focus on understanding how organisms respond to environmental stimuli and how behaviors can be conditioned, reinforced, and modified over time. The central claim of behaviorism is that human and animal behavior can be explained purely in terms of external stimuli and responses, without the need to reference internal mental states, thoughts, or emotions. Behaviorism emerged in the early 20th century as a reaction against introspective psychology, which relied on the observation of internal mental states, and psychoanalysis, which focused on unconscious desires and drives. It was influenced by the work of early psychologists such as Ivan Pavlov, John B. Watson, and B. F. Skinner. These thinkers sought to establish psychology as a more rigorous and scientific discipline by focusing on measurable and observable behavior. One of the key features of behaviorism is its emphasis on conditioning, the process by which behaviors are learned or modified through repeated exposure to stimuli. Classical conditioning, developed by Ivan Pavlov, is one of the most well-known concepts in behaviorism. In classical conditioning, an organism learns to associate a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus that naturally elicits a response. After repeated pairings, the neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus that elicits a similar response. A classic example is Pavlov's experiment with dogs, where the sound of a bell, neutral stimulus, was repeatedly paired with the presentation of food, unconditioned stimulus. Eventually, the sound of the bell alone was enough to make the dogs salivate, even in the absence of food. Operant conditioning, a concept developed by B. F. Skinner, is another key element of behaviorism. In operant conditioning, behaviors are shaped by their consequences. When a behavior is followed by a positive outcome, such as a reward, it is more likely to be repeated. Conversely, when a behavior is followed by a negative outcome, such as punishment, it is less likely to occur again. Skinner conducted a variety of experiments with animals, particularly rats and pigeons, to demonstrate how behaviors could be shaped through reinforcement and punishment. For example, a rat in a Skinner box might learn to press a lever to receive a food pellet, positive reinforcement, or it might learn to avoid a mild electric shock by not pressing the lever, negative reinforcement. The behaviorist perspective holds that all behaviors, from simple reflexes to complex actions, can be explained in terms of conditioning and the stimuli that reinforce or punish them. Behaviorists reject the idea that mental states or consciousness play a meaningful role in understanding behavior. According to this view, even seemingly complex behaviors, such as language acquisition, can be understood in terms of conditioning. For example, B. F. Skinner argued that children learn language through reinforcement and imitation. They are rewarded for correctly mimicking words and phrases, and this encourages the development of language skills over time. Behaviorism also adopts a scientific and empirical approach to psychology. Behaviorists are committed to studying observable, measurable phenomena and conducting experiments that can be replicated and verified. By focusing on external behavior and its relationship to stimuli and responses, behaviorism aims to make psychology more objective and grounded in empirical evidence. Behaviorists argue that internal mental states are inherently subjective and difficult to study scientifically, and thus should be excluded from psychological inquiry. As a result, behaviorism became the dominant paradigm in psychology for much of the 20th century. Despite its successes and influence, behaviorism has faced significant criticism, particularly in the areas of its neglect of mental states and its reliance on overly simplistic explanations of behavior. One major criticism is that behaviorism cannot adequately explain all aspects of human behavior, particularly complex cognitive functions like thinking, problem-solving, and creativity. Critics argue that behaviorism reduces human beings to mere machines that respond to stimuli, ignoring the rich inner lives, intentions, and goals that are central to human experience. Cognitive psychology, which emerged in the 1950s and 1960s, arose as a reaction to behaviorism's emphasis on external behavior and its neglect of mental processes. Cognitive psychologists argue that understanding human behavior requires taking into account internal mental states such as beliefs, desires, memories, and perceptions. Cognitive theories focus on how the mind processes information, how people reason and make decisions, and how knowledge is represented and stored in the brain. This shift toward the study of cognition led to the decline of behaviorism as the dominant approach in psychology, as it became clear that many aspects of human behavior could not be fully explained by external stimuli and reinforcement alone. One of the central criticisms of behaviorism comes from the field of linguistics, particularly in relation to language acquisition. Behaviorist accounts of language learning, such as Skinner's theory, suggested that children learn language by imitating what they hear and receiving reinforcement for correct usage. However, this explanation has been challenged by Noam Chomsky, a linguist who argued that children have an innate capacity for language and do not simply learn through imitation and reinforcement. Chomsky's critique of behaviorism is encapsulated in his famous review of Skinner's book Verbal Behavior, in which he argued that children can produce sentences they have never heard before, suggesting that language acquisition cannot be explained solely by behaviorist principles of imitation and reinforcement. Chomsky proposed instead that children possess an inherent universal grammar that enables them to learn language. Behaviorism has also been criticized for its lack of attention to subjective experience or consciousness. Critics argue that by focusing only on observable behavior, behaviorism ignores the rich, subjective world of thoughts, emotions, and mental experiences. The famous philosopher of mind, Gilbert Ryle, referred to this criticism as the ghost in the machine problem, where behaviorists are accused of treating the mind as a mere set of behaviors without considering the inner mental processes that generate those behaviors. While behaviorism can explain how behaviors are learned and modified, it struggles to explain the experience of being a conscious being, something that is central to our understanding of ourselves. Despite these criticisms, behaviorism remains an important part of the history of psychology and continues to influence certain areas of research and practice. For example, behaviorist principles are widely used in fields such as behavior therapy, where techniques like reinforcement and punishment are used to modify undesirable behaviors. Applied behavior analysis, ABA, is a widely used therapeutic approach based on behaviorist principles, particularly in the treatment of autism spectrum disorder, ASD. In ABA, therapists use positive reinforcement to encourage desired behaviors and reduce maladaptive behaviors in children with autism. In addition, behaviorism has had a lasting impact on the study of learning and motivation. The basic principles of conditioning and reinforcement have been applied to a wide range of fields, including education, animal training, and organizational behavior. For instance, in educational settings, teachers use positive reinforcement, praise, rewards, to encourage desirable behaviors in students, such as completing assignments or demonstrating good manners. Similarly, in workplaces, employers use incentives and rewards to motivate employees to perform tasks and meet goals. In conclusion, behaviorism is a theory in psychology and philosophy that focuses on the study of observable behavior, rather than internal mental states or consciousness. It emphasizes the role of conditioning, reinforcement, and punishment in shaping behavior, and rejects the idea that mental states are necessary for explaining human and animal actions. While behaviorism was highly influential in psychology, it has faced criticism for its neglect of mental processes and its inability to explain complex cognitive phenomena. Despite these challenges, behaviorism continues to have a lasting impact on both psychological theory and practice, particularly in areas like therapy, learning, and motivation. Logical positivism, also known as logical empiricism, is a philosophical movement that emerged in the early 20th century, primarily among a group of philosophers and scientists known as the Vienna Circle. The movement was a response to the challenges of metaphysics and the desire to bring scientific rigor and empirical validation to philosophical inquiry. Logical positivism holds that meaningful statements must either be empirically verifiable or logically necessary, and it is highly critical of metaphysical claims that cannot be verified through direct experience or logical deduction. At its core, logical positivism aims to establish a clear criterion for meaningful language and meaningful propositions. It rejects statements that are not verifiable or logically tautological, such as metaphysical, theological, or ethical claims, which it regards as meaningless or nonsensical. According to the logical positivists, the only cognitively meaningful statements are those that can be empirically tested through observation and experiment, or those that are true by definition, such as mathematical and logical truths. The Vienna Circle, led by figures like Moritz Schlick, Rudolf Carnap, and Otto Neurath, is often seen as the birthplace of logical positivism. These philosophers were influenced by the developments in formal logic and mathematics, especially the work of Gottlob Frege, Bertrand Russell, and Ludwig Wittgenstein, as well as by the success of the natural sciences in explaining the world. The movement sought to use the methods of the sciences and formal logic to clarify and demarcate the boundaries of meaningful discourse. The fundamental principle of logical positivism is the verification principle, which asserts that a proposition is meaningful only if it can be empirically verified or is logically tautological. The verification principle has its roots in the work of the British philosopher A. J. Ayer, who popularized it in his 1936 book, Language, Truth, and Logic. According to Ayer and the logical positivists, statements about the world can be divided into two categories: those that are empirically verifiable and those that are analytically true. Empirical verification refers to the process of confirming a statement through sensory experience or scientific observation. For example, the statement, "the sky is blue," can be verified through direct observation. On the other hand, analytic truths are those that are true by virtue of their meaning, such as, "all bachelors are unmarried men." These statements do not require empirical verification because their truth is guaranteed by the meanings of the words involved. In contrast to these categories, logical positivists argue that metaphysical, theological, and ethical statements are not meaningful because they cannot be empirically verified or logically deduced. For example, statements like, God exists, or the ultimate nature of reality is beyond human comprehension, are deemed meaningless because they cannot be subjected to empirical observation or logical analysis. The logical positivists' stance on metaphysics was highly critical, as they believed that much of traditional philosophy had been devoted to metaphysical speculation that lacked meaningful content. Logical positivism also sought to bring a scientific approach to philosophy by emphasizing the role of observation and experiment in determining the truth of statements. This scientific orientation was part of the broader movement known as the scientific worldview, which viewed science as the most reliable means of gaining knowledge about the world. In this view, philosophy's role was not to speculate about metaphysical entities or engage in abstract theorizing, but rather to clarify concepts, analyze language, and ensure that philosophical discourse aligned with the methods of the sciences. This focus on the empirical and the logical became a hallmark of the movement. The rise of logical positivism was also influenced by the work of early 20th century developments in formal logic and the philosophy of language. Logical positivism borrowed heavily from the developments of symbolic logic, which had revolutionized the way philosophers and logicians approached reasoning and the structure of language. Figures like Frege, Russell, and Whitehead made key contributions to the development of symbolic logic, which allowed philosophers to analyze statements with greater precision and clarity. Logical positivism adopted these logical tools in order to clarify the meaning of statements and evaluate their empirical verifiability. In its emphasis on logical analysis and empirical verification, logical positivism drew inspiration from the philosophy of science, particularly the work of the German philosopher and scientist Ernst Mach. Mach argued that scientific knowledge should be grounded in empirical observations, and that scientific theories should be judged based on their empirical adequacy rather than their metaphysical assumptions. This empirical orientation resonated with the logical positivists, who viewed philosophy as an extension of the scientific method. However, despite its initial successes, logical positivism faced significant challenges and criticisms, particularly in relation to its verification principle. One of the most famous critiques of logical positivism came from the philosopher Karl Popper, who argued that the verification principle itself could not be empirically verified. Popper contended that the principle was self-refuting, as it could not meet its own standard of verification. According to Popper, scientific theories should be falsifiable, meaning that they should be testable in such a way that they could potentially be proven false. This idea of falsifiability became central to Popper's philosophy of science and served as an alternative to the verificationist criterion of meaning. Another significant criticism of logical positivism came from the philosopher Willard Van Orman Quine, who challenged the sharp distinction between analytic and synthetic statements, which was a key tenet of the logical positivist framework. Quine argued that there is no clear-cut separation between statements that are true by definition, analytic, and those that are true based on empirical observation, synthetic. In his famous essay, Two Dogmas of Empiricism, Quine demonstrated that the meanings of statements are often entangled with empirical knowledge, and that there is no simple way to distinguish between analytic and synthetic truths. Quine's critique undermined one of the foundational ideas of logical positivism and contributed to the movement's decline. The rise of postmodernism and the development of alternative philosophical approaches in the mid-20th century also contributed to the decline of logical positivism. In particular, the work of philosophers such as Ludwig Wittgenstein, Thomas Kuhn, and Michel Foucault highlighted the limits of logical analysis and the social and historical dimensions of knowledge. Wittgenstein's later philosophy, particularly his concept of language games and his critique of the idea of a fixed, objective language, offered a challenge to the logical positivists' emphasis on precise, empirical verification. Similarly, Kuhn's work on scientific revolutions emphasized the historical and social context of scientific knowledge, challenging the idea that science operates through a straightforward process of observation and verification. Despite its decline, logical positivism had a significant impact on the philosophy of science and philosophy more broadly. Its emphasis on the importance of empirical verification and the logical analysis of language influenced the development of scientific philosophy and analytic philosophy in the 20th century. The legacy of the logical positivists can be seen in the continued emphasis on clarity, precision, and the use of formal methods in contemporary philosophy. In conclusion, logical positivism was a 20th century philosophical movement that sought to establish a scientific and empirical approach to philosophy by focusing on observable, verifiable statements and rejecting metaphysical speculation. It emphasized the use of formal logic and empirical verification as criteria for meaningful discourse, and argued that philosophical inquiry should be grounded in the methods of the natural sciences. While the movement faced significant criticisms and declined in prominence, its influence on the philosophy of science and analytic philosophy remains enduring. The legacy of logical positivism continues to shape contemporary debates about the nature of knowledge, language, and meaning. The trolley problem is a famous thought experiment in ethics and moral philosophy that presents a moral dilemma involving a choice between two equally undesirable outcomes. The problem is designed to explore the conflict between utilitarianism and deontological ethics, raising important questions about the nature of moral decision-making, the value of individual lives, and the consequences of one's actions. The trolley problem typically begins with a scenario in which a runaway trolley is headed toward 5 people who are tied to the tracks and will be killed if the trolley continues on its current path. However, the person faced with the dilemma is standing next to a lever that can switch the trolley onto a different track. This second track contains only one person who will be killed if the trolley is diverted. The question posed is whether it is morally permissible to pull the lever, causing the trolley to kill one person but saving 5 others, or whether one should refrain from acting, allowing the trolley to kill the 5 people. The dilemma highlights a tension between 2 major ethical theories: utilitarianism and deontology. Utilitarianism is a consequentialist theory that holds that the morally right action is the one that maximizes overall happiness or well-being. From a utilitarian perspective, the right course of action would be to pull the lever, since doing so would result in the least harm by saving 5 lives at the cost of 1. This decision would be seen as morally justified because it leads to the greatest overall benefit. On the other hand, deontological ethics, particularly as articulated by philosopher Immanuel Kant, emphasizes the importance of moral duties, rules, and principles, regardless of the consequences. From a deontological perspective, it might be argued that pulling the lever is morally wrong, because it involves intentionally causing harm to an innocent person. Even though the outcome might result in fewer deaths, the act of directly intervening to kill one person may violate moral duties or principles, such as the prohibition against killing. Therefore, a deontologist might conclude that it is wrong to pull the lever, even if it results in greater overall harm. The trolley problem also invites further variations and complexities. For example, one common variation introduces the option of pushing a large person onto the tracks in front of the trolley, which would stop the trolley and save the 5 people. In this version of the problem, the person faced with the dilemma must decide whether to actively push a person to their death in order to save the others. This variation introduces additional moral questions about the acceptability of using another person as a means to an end, which is a central concern in deontological ethics. Pushing someone in this version might be seen as morally impermissible because it involves treating the person as a mere tool for achieving a desired outcome, violating Kant's principle of treating individuals as ends in themselves and not as means to an end. Another variation involves the question of whether personal relationships influence moral decisions. Suppose that one of the 5 people on the tracks is a loved one or a close friend. Would the decision to pull the lever change based on the relationship between the person making the decision and the individuals involved? This variation raises questions about favoritism, bias, and the role of emotions in moral decision-making. Some might argue that it is morally wrong to prioritize the life of a loved one over the lives of strangers, while others may argue that emotional bonds and personal relationships should be taken into account when making moral choices. In addition to the philosophical implications, the trolley problem also has practical applications in areas like law, medicine, and artificial intelligence. In law, for example, the problem raises questions about how we should weigh the consequences of our actions when they result in harm to others. Should we judge individuals based solely on the outcomes of their actions, or should we consider their intentions and the moral principles involved? In medicine, the trolley problem can be used to explore dilemmas involving resource allocation, such as decisions about how to allocate limited medical resources, e.g., ventilators or organs for transplant, when not everyone can be saved. In the realm of artificial intelligence, the trolley problem has been used to discuss the ethics of autonomous vehicles. If a self-driving car were to encounter a situation in which it must choose between swerving to avoid hitting a pedestrian but causing the death of the car's passengers, or staying on course and hitting the pedestrian, how should the car make its decision? The trolley problem, in this context, raises questions about programming moral decisions into machines, and whether machines can be trusted to make ethical choices. Should a self-driving car be programmed to act like a utilitarian, maximizing the number of lives saved, or should it follow a deontological approach, avoiding harm to individuals at all costs? Over time, philosophers and ethicists have proposed various solutions and responses to the trolley problem, none of which are universally accepted. Some argue that utilitarianism provides the most rational and morally justifiable solution, as it minimizes harm and maximizes well-being. Others defend deontological approaches, emphasizing that moral rules and principles should take precedence over the consequences of actions. Some have suggested that moral decision-making is more nuanced than a strict application of any one ethical theory, and that context, intentions, and other factors should be taken into account when making moral choices. One interesting response to the trolley problem is to frame it in terms of moral luck, a concept that explores the role of chance and external factors in moral judgment. Moral luck refers to the idea that people can be judged for actions or outcomes that are beyond their control. In the context of the trolley problem, the individual making the decision might face a moral dilemma that depends heavily on factors beyond their control, such as the position of the people on the tracks or the speed of the trolley. Some philosophers argue that our moral judgments should account for the ways in which luck or chance influences the outcomes of our actions. The trolley problem also raises questions about the value of human life. Should all lives be treated equally, or do some lives have greater moral value than others? The question of whether it is morally permissible to sacrifice one life to save many others touches on deep ethical questions about the intrinsic worth of individual lives and the role of moral responsibility in determining how we value others. While the trolley problem has been primarily discussed in philosophical contexts, it has also been popularized in mainstream media and public discourse. It has been used in discussions of ethics in politics, technology, and social justice, highlighting the ways in which moral decision-making can shape society. The problem's simple yet powerful structure makes it an effective tool for stimulating ethical reflection and debate. In conclusion, the trolley problem is a powerful and enduring thought experiment that presents a moral dilemma with no easy solution. It raises important questions about the nature of moral decision-making, the role of consequences and principles, and the value of human life. By presenting the conflict between utilitarian and deontological ethics, the problem highlights the difficulties of making moral choices in situations where all options seem ethically fraught. The trolley problem has been used to explore issues in fields such as law, medicine, and artificial intelligence, making it a valuable tool for examining the complexities of ethical decision-making in both theory and practice. Ultimately, the trolley problem challenges us to reflect on the principles that guide our moral judgments and how we balance the needs of individuals and the greater good. Objectivism is a philosophical system developed by the Russian-American philosopher Ayn Rand, which emphasizes individualism, self-interest, and capitalism as the foundation for a rational and moral life. The philosophy presents a vision of human flourishing rooted in reason, the pursuit of personal happiness, and the creation of wealth through productive work. Objectivism asserts that reality is objective and independent of human perception, that reason is the primary means of knowledge, and that the proper moral purpose of life is the pursuit of one's own happiness. At the heart of objectivism is the belief in the objectivity of reality. According to Rand, the world exists independently of consciousness, and facts are what they are regardless of personal feelings or desires. She strongly rejected any form of subjective idealism, solipsism, or relativism, which suggests that reality is shaped by individual or collective perceptions. Objectivism holds that individuals must act in accordance with the objective reality, meaning that human beings must use reason, guided by observable facts, to understand the world and make decisions. This objective view of reality extends to the field of ethics, where objectivism advocates for a morality based on rational self-interest, sometimes referred to as egoism. Rand argued that individuals should act in their own best interests, seeking their own happiness as their highest moral purpose. Unlike traditional ethical systems, which often emphasize self-sacrifice or duty to others, objectivism posits that each person is an end in themselves and should never sacrifice their values or well-being for the sake of others. This view is encapsulated in Rand's famous assertion that the pursuit of one's own happiness is the highest moral purpose of life. Central to objectivist ethics is the concept of rational self-interest. Rand argued that human beings should act according to reason, seeking long-term happiness and fulfillment rather than immediate gratification or acting on whims. Rational self-interest, according to Rand, involves using one's mind to understand reality and make choices that are in alignment with one's true, long-term interests. This concept is grounded in the belief that human beings are capable of reason, and that reason is the only means by which they can achieve their goals. Rationality is seen as a virtue in objectivism, and it forms the foundation for all other moral virtues, such as honesty, integrity, independence, and justice. Objectivism also champions the importance of individual rights, particularly the right to life, liberty, and property. Rand argued that a just society is one in which individuals are free to act according to their own rational self-interest, without interference from others or the government. In this view, the role of government is limited to protecting individual rights, particularly by maintaining a system of laws that prohibits the initiation of force or fraud. Objectivism opposes collectivism and statism, advocating instead for a capitalist society where voluntary exchange and competition foster prosperity and innovation. In her economic philosophy, Rand was a staunch defender of laissez-faire capitalism. She believed that capitalism is the only social system that allows individuals to act in their own rational self-interest while respecting the rights of others. Under capitalism, individuals are free to pursue their own goals, engage in voluntary trade, and accumulate wealth based on their abilities and talents. Rand's ideal society is one in which individuals are free to make their own choices without interference from the state or any collective group, and where the government exists solely to protect individual rights and maintain law and order. Objectivism rejects any form of altruism, which Rand saw as the moral doctrine that holds that self-sacrifice for the sake of others is virtuous. Altruism, in Rand's view, requires individuals to place the interests of others above their own, which she argued leads to the destruction of individual self-esteem and undermines human flourishing. In contrast, objectivism asserts that individuals should pursue their own happiness and well-being, and that acting in one's own self-interest is not only moral, but necessary for the survival and flourishing of individuals and society as a whole. One of the key components of objectivism is the belief in the virtue of productivity. Rand saw work and productivity as essential to human life, as they are the means by which individuals create value, build their futures, and achieve personal success. Objectivism emphasizes the importance of creating wealth through productive work and rejects the idea that individuals should depend on charity or the welfare state. In this view, the ability to produce is central to an individual's life and success, and it is through the act of production that individuals can create the conditions necessary for their happiness. In addition to its ethical and economic principles, objectivism also provides a unique perspective on art and aesthetics. Rand argued that art is a reflection of the values and ideals of the artist, and that it has an important role to play in human life. For objectivists, art should be rooted in realism, as it should depict life as it could be and ought to be, in alignment with human potential and rational values. Rand's view of art was based on her belief that human beings are capable of achieving greatness, and that art should serve as an inspiration to individuals to strive for their own highest potential. Despite its influence in certain philosophical and political circles, objectivism has been the subject of criticism from many quarters. Critics have challenged the philosophy's emphasis on individualism, arguing that it promotes selfishness and disregards the needs of others. They contend that a society focused solely on individual self-interest could lead to social fragmentation, inequality, and a lack of compassion for the less fortunate. Critics of objectivism also argue that its rejection of altruism and emphasis on rational self-interest overlooks the importance of empathy and cooperation in building a just society. Another criticism of objectivism comes from those who question its view of human nature. Some argue that Rand's ideal of the fully rational, independent individual is unrealistic, as human beings are often influenced by emotions, social bonds, and irrational impulses. Others have pointed out that objectivism's emphasis on individual rights and self-interest can conflict with the idea of social responsibility, particularly in areas like public health, education, and the environment, where collective action is often required to address large-scale issues. Furthermore, Rand's staunch defense of capitalism has been criticized for its lack of attention to the potential downsides of unregulated markets, such as inequality, exploitation, and environmental degradation. While objectivism promotes capitalism as a system of voluntary exchange, critics argue that capitalism can lead to monopolies, wealth concentration, and economic injustice, particularly when it is left unchecked by regulation or social safety nets. In response to these criticisms, proponents of objectivism argue that the philosophy's emphasis on individual rights and rational self-interest is essential for ensuring a just and prosperous society. They contend that by allowing individuals to freely pursue their own goals and create value through productive work, objectivism fosters innovation, creativity, and social progress. They also argue that capitalism, when practiced in its purest form, is the most effective system for promoting individual freedom and economic prosperity, as it enables people to achieve their potential and rewards merit and effort. In addition to its criticisms, objectivism has also had a lasting impact on political philosophy and libertarian thought. The philosophy has influenced a wide range of thinkers, writers, and political activists, particularly those who advocate for limited government, individual freedom, and free markets. Rand's work has inspired a movement that seeks to promote individual rights, capitalism, and the rejection of collectivism. And her ideas continue to shape debates on topics such as taxation, government regulation, and personal liberty. In conclusion, objectivism is a philosophical system that advocates for rational self-interest, individual rights, and capitalism as the foundation of a moral and prosperous society. The philosophy rejects altruism and emphasizes the importance of reason, productive work, and personal happiness as the highest moral goals. While objectivism has faced criticism for its focus on individualism and its defense of capitalism, it has also had a profound influence on political thought and continues to inspire those who advocate for individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Objectivism presents a vision of human life that is rooted in reason, independence, and the pursuit of personal happiness, and it challenges individuals to live according to their own values and goals. Transhumanism is a philosophical and intellectual movement that advocates for the use of advanced technology to enhance the human condition, with the ultimate goal of transcending the biological limitations of the human body. The central idea of transhumanism is that humans can and should leverage technological advancements to improve physical, mental, and emotional capacities, leading to a post-human future in which humans can surpass the boundaries set by nature. The movement is rooted in the belief that science and technology have the potential to radically transform humanity for the better, opening the door to an era of unprecedented human flourishing. At the core of transhumanist thought is the concept of human enhancement, which refers to the use of technology to augment human abilities beyond their natural limits. This includes the possibility of enhancing physical characteristics, such as strength, speed, and longevity, as well as cognitive abilities, such as intelligence, memory, and emotional resilience. Transhumanists envision a future where these enhancements not only improve the quality of life, but also eliminate diseases, disabilities, and aging itself, potentially leading to an era of radical longevity or even immortality. One of the primary goals of transhumanism is the pursuit of life extension. Aging, which is considered by many to be an inevitable and inescapable biological process, is seen by transhumanists as a problem to be solved through scientific and technological innovation. Transhumanists advocate for the development of anti-aging treatments, such as genetic engineering, nanotechnology, and regenerative medicine, which could dramatically extend human lifespan and improve the quality of life in old age. Many transhumanists believe that aging is not a natural process, but rather a disease that can be cured with the right advancements in biotechnology and medical research. In addition to life extension, cognitive enhancement is another key aspect of transhumanist thought. Transhumanists argue that humans should not be limited by the constraints of our current biological brains, and that technological advancements could improve mental capacities such as intelligence, memory, learning speed, and emotional regulation. This could be achieved through various means, including brain-computer interfaces, neural implants, and genetic modifications. By enhancing cognitive abilities, transhumanists believe that humans could become more intelligent, creative, and capable of solving complex problems, leading to greater personal and collective achievement. Transhumanism also envisions a future in which humans can merge with machines or artificial intelligence, AI, to overcome the physical and cognitive limitations of the human body. One concept closely related to this idea is cyborgization, where humans integrate with technology to enhance their biological functions. This could involve augmenting the human body with robotic prosthetics, exoskeletons, or implanted devices that allow individuals to achieve superhuman capabilities. Another possibility is uploading human consciousness into machines, which is sometimes referred to as mind uploading or whole brain emulation. The goal of mind uploading is to transfer the contents of the human mind, including memories, thoughts, and experiences, into a digital substrate, effectively achieving immortality by preserving the consciousness in a machine. The notion of merging with machines, or AI, is tied to the broader concept of the singularity, a term popularized by futurist Ray Kurzweil. The singularity refers to a hypothetical future moment when technological progress accelerates to the point that it becomes uncontrollable and irreversible, leading to profound changes in human civilization. According to singularity proponents, this event will be driven by the development of superintelligent AI that surpasses human intelligence, leading to a merger between humans and machines. Transhumanists view the singularity as a transformative event that could fundamentally reshape humanity, creating a post-human society where individuals are no longer constrained by their biological limitations. While the benefits of transhumanism may seem appealing, the movement has raised a number of ethical, social, and philosophical questions. One of the main concerns is the potential for inequality and social division. The ability to enhance oneself through technology may not be available to everyone, creating a divide between those who have access to enhancement technologies and those who do not. This could lead to the creation of a genetic aristocracy, where the wealthy and privileged have access to life-extending treatments and cognitive enhancements, while the rest of society remains behind. Some critics argue that transhumanism could exacerbate existing social inequalities, leading to a future where only a select few benefit from technological advancements. There are also concerns about the loss of what it means to be human. Critics argue that transhumanism's emphasis on technological enhancement and the pursuit of post-human existence could lead to a devaluation of the human experience and the biological aspects of human life. If humans were to merge with machines or achieve immortality through mind uploading, some worry that individuals would lose their sense of identity, autonomy, and connection to the natural world. The idea of post-humanism, which explores the possibility of transcending human nature altogether, has sparked debates about whether such a future would be desirable, or whether it would result in the loss of essential aspects of humanity. In addition, transhumanism raises questions about the ethics of genetic modification, particularly in the context of designer babies and germline editing. Advances in genetic engineering, such as CRISPR-Cas9 technology, have made it possible to edit the genes of embryos to prevent genetic diseases or enhance certain traits. While this technology holds the promise of eliminating hereditary diseases, it also raises concerns about the potential for eugenics and the creation of genetically engineered humans with enhanced physical or intellectual traits. Some fear that this could lead to the creation of a genetic arms race, where parents strive to give their children the best possible genetic advantages, further perpetuating social inequalities. Another challenge faced by transhumanism is the potential for unintended consequences. As technology continues to advance at an exponential rate, it is difficult to predict the long-term effects of widespread human enhancement. There are concerns that enhancements designed to improve human abilities could have unforeseen negative consequences, such as the creation of new forms of inequality, social alienation, or even the loss of essential aspects of human nature. Furthermore, the rapid development of AI and machine learning raises the possibility of creating entities that surpass human intelligence, potentially posing risks to human survival and autonomy. Despite these challenges, transhumanism has gained significant traction in recent years, particularly in the fields of biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and futurism. Many prominent scientists, technologists, and philosophers have endorsed aspects of transhumanist thought, arguing that the pursuit of human enhancement is a natural extension of human progress, and that it holds the potential to solve some of humanity's most pressing problems, such as disease, aging, and environmental degradation. The movement has also sparked the formation of organizations and think tanks dedicated to advancing the goals of transhumanism, such as the Humanity Plus Organization and the Institute for Molecular Medicine. These groups promote research and advocacy in areas such as life extension, cognitive enhancement, and AI safety, and they work to raise awareness of the potential benefits and risks associated with human enhancement technologies. In addition, transhumanism has inspired a new generation of thinkers, inventors, and entrepreneurs who are working to bring about the technological advancements envisioned by the movement. Companies like Elon Musk's Neuralink, which is developing brain-computer interfaces, and Aubrey de Grey's SENS Research Foundation, which is focused on developing anti-aging therapies, are at the forefront of the transhumanist agenda, pushing the boundaries of science and technology to achieve a future of radical human enhancement. In conclusion, transhumanism is a philosophical movement that advocates for the use of advanced technology to enhance human capabilities and transcend biological limitations. The movement envisions a future where humans can overcome aging, disease, and cognitive limitations, and even merge with machines or artificial intelligence. While transhumanism holds the promise of improving the human condition and ushering in a new era of human flourishing, it also raises significant ethical, social, and philosophical questions, particularly regarding inequality, the loss of humanity, and the potential risks of technological advancement. Despite these challenges, transhumanism continues to inspire debates and advancements in fields such as biotechnology, artificial intelligence, and futurism, shaping the future of human development in profound ways. Libertarianism is a political philosophy that emphasizes individual liberty, limited government, and free markets as the essential components of a just society. It is rooted in the belief that individuals should have the freedom to make their own choices and pursue their own happiness, provided they do not infringe upon the rights of others. The central tenet of libertarianism is the idea that the role of the state should be minimal, primarily focused on protecting individual rights, maintaining law and order, and ensuring the safety of its citizens. Libertarians argue that governments should not interfere in the personal or economic lives of individuals unless it is to protect their rights to life, liberty, and property. At the heart of libertarianism is the concept of individual freedom. Libertarians believe that each person has the right to live their life as they see fit, provided that they do not harm others or violate their rights. This includes the freedom to make personal decisions about one's body, relationships, and lifestyle without interference from the state or other individuals. Libertarianism opposes paternalism, the idea that the government or society should intervene in people's lives for their own good. According to libertarians, individuals are the best judges of their own interests and should be free to make their own choices, even if those choices are considered risky or unpopular by others. The principle of non-aggression is a fundamental aspect of libertarian thought. Libertarians believe that the initiation of force or coercion is morally wrong, and that individuals should resolve conflicts peacefully and voluntarily. This principle is encapsulated in the non-aggression principle, NAP, which states that individuals should not use force or the threat of force against others, except in self-defense. The NAP applies not only to interactions between individuals, but also to the role of government. Libertarians argue that a just government should not use force to enforce laws or collect taxes, but should instead be based on voluntary consent and the protection of individual rights. Libertarianism also advocates for a free market economy, where individuals are free to engage in voluntary trade and exchange without government interference. In this view, the market is the most efficient means of allocating resources and creating wealth. Libertarians believe that government regulation of business, labor, and trade stifles innovation, reduces competition, and creates inefficiencies. Instead, they advocate for a system in which individuals and businesses are free to engage in market transactions based on mutual consent, and prices are determined by supply and demand, not by government dictates. In a truly free market, libertarians argue, individuals are empowered to make decisions based on their own needs and desires, which leads to greater prosperity for all. Libertarianism's commitment to free markets extends to the idea of property rights. Libertarians believe that individuals have the right to own property and control it as they see fit, whether that property is land, goods, or intellectual property. Property rights are seen as essential to individual freedom, as they allow individuals to control their resources and make decisions about how to use or exchange them. Libertarians argue that the protection of property rights is a fundamental function of government, and that any government action that interferes with property rights, such as taxation, eminent domain, or regulation, is a violation of individual liberty. One of the core beliefs of libertarianism is that government should be as small and limited as possible. Libertarians advocate for a minimal state, often referred to as a night watchman state, whose sole purpose is to protect individuals from force, fraud, and coercion. In practice, this means that the government should focus on protecting individual rights, enforcing contracts, providing national defense, and maintaining public order. Libertarians argue that all other government functions, such as social welfare programs, education, healthcare, and environmental regulation, should be privatized or left to voluntary, non-governmental institutions. They believe that government intervention in these areas often leads to inefficiencies, infringements on personal freedom, and the creation of dependency rather than the positive outcomes it intends to achieve. In the realm of taxation, libertarians argue that taxes are a form of theft, as they involve the forced confiscation of an individual's property to fund government activities. Libertarians believe that individuals have the right to keep the fruits of their labor and should not be compelled to pay taxes to fund government programs, particularly those that they may disagree with or that do not serve their interests. Some libertarians advocate for the abolition of income taxes altogether, while others argue for a drastically reduced tax burden, particularly on business and trade. Many libertarians also support the idea of a flat tax or consumption tax, as opposed to the current progressive tax system, which they see as unfair and punitive. Another key tenet of libertarianism is the idea of voluntary association. Libertarians argue that individuals should be free to associate with whomever they choose, whether that means forming business partnerships, social groups, or political organizations. This principle extends to the right to freely contract and enter into agreements without government interference. In a libertarian society, individuals would be free to form their own institutions and organizations without the need for government authorization or regulation. This includes the freedom to establish schools, charities, hospitals, and other social institutions based on voluntary cooperation, rather than relying on government-funded programs. Libertarians are also strong proponents of personal responsibility. They believe that individuals are responsible for their own actions and should not rely on government or others to solve their problems. Libertarians argue that a society based on personal responsibility and individual freedom encourages people to take ownership of their lives, make thoughtful decisions, and solve their own problems. This is in contrast to collectivist ideologies, which often emphasize the role of the state in addressing social issues and providing for the needs of individuals. Critics of libertarianism argue that its focus on individual liberty and minimal government intervention can lead to inequality, social unrest, and the erosion of important social institutions. One of the primary concerns is that a completely free market could result in the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few individuals or corporations, leading to monopolies, exploitation, and the marginalization of vulnerable groups. Critics argue that government regulation is necessary to protect consumers, workers, and the environment, and to ensure that businesses act ethically and in the public interest. Furthermore, opponents of libertarianism point out that a minimal state might be unable to address certain social issues, such as poverty, healthcare, education, and environmental protection. They argue that the government has a role to play in ensuring a basic standard of living for all citizens, and in addressing systemic inequalities that may arise in a purely free market system. Some critics also argue that the libertarian emphasis on personal responsibility may not account for the structural factors that contribute to poverty and inequality, such as lack of access to education, health care, and social services. In addition, critics of libertarianism question the feasibility of creating a completely free market, arguing that some degree of government regulation is necessary to ensure fair competition and prevent abuses of power. They contend that businesses often exploit workers, consumers, and the environment when left unchecked, and that government intervention is necessary to protect public health and safety. Despite these criticisms, libertarianism has garnered significant support from individuals who advocate for personal freedom, individual rights, and limited government. In recent years, the movement has gained prominence in political debates, particularly in the United States, where libertarian ideas have influenced both conservative and progressive circles. Many libertarians have become involved in political activism, advocating for policies such as tax cuts, deregulation, and the protection of civil liberties. The Libertarian Party, established in the 1970s, serves as a political vehicle for those who embrace libertarian principles and seek to challenge the dominance of the two major political parties. Libertarianism has also influenced a number of other political and economic movements, such as the Austrian School of Economics, which emphasizes free markets, sound money, and limited government intervention in the economy. Thinkers like Friedrich Hayek, Milton Friedman, and Ludwig von Mises have shaped the development of libertarian thought, providing intellectual support for the ideas of free market capitalism and individual liberty. In conclusion, libertarianism is a political philosophy that advocates for individual freedom, limited government, and free markets as the foundation for a just society. Libertarians believe that individuals should be free to make their own choices and pursue their own happiness, provided they do not harm others. The philosophy is grounded in the principles of non-aggression, property rights, and voluntary association, and it seeks to minimize government intervention in the lives of individuals. While libertarianism has faced criticism for its potential to exacerbate inequality and social division, it has had a lasting impact on political thought, inspiring debates about the proper role of government, the rights of individuals, and the nature of freedom in society.